Hello, explorers of the unknown. Welcome to Channel Name, where we dive into the greatest mysteries of UFOs and alien life. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep bringing you these enigmatic stories. Leave a like and comment where you're watching from. Now buckle up, because today's story takes us to an unexpected extraterrestrial encounter. From my earliest memories, the forests surrounding my grandmother's farm have always been a sanctuary for me. As a child, those woods were an endless playground, a place where my imagination could run wild and free. My older brother and I would spend countless hours exploring the hidden trails that wound their way through the pines and oaks, building forts from fallen branches and crafting stories that transported us to distant worlds. That land became an extension of who I was, a place where laughter echoed through the trees and adventures awaited around every bend. The bond I shared with my brother in those woods was unbreakable, forged through shared secrets and the thrill of discovery. But life has a way of changing even the most cherished things. When my brother passed away, the pain was almost unbearable. The woods, once filled with our shared joy, became a bittersweet reminder of what I had lost. Yet, in a strange way, they also became my solace. Walking those familiar paths alone, I found comfort in the memories that lingered there, like whispers in the rustling leaves. I never expected that these woods, so familiar and safe, could become the setting for an experience that would shake the very foundation of my reality. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when I decided to venture deeper into the forest than I had in years. My destination was an old lightning-struck oak that stood near the river, a landmark from my childhood explorations. The sun filtered through the canopy, creating a mesmerizing dance of light and shadow along the trail. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that the path seemed longer than I remembered. The trees seemed to loom larger, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I brushed off the unease, attributing it to the years that had passed since I'd last visited this part of the woods. When I finally reached the river, I paused to catch my breath. For a brief moment, everything seemed normal. The gentle burble of the water, the chirping of birds, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But then, without warning, an eerie silence descended upon the forest. It was as if someone had suddenly muted the world around me. The breeze died, the birds fell silent, and not a single creature stirred. Even the river seemed to quiet its flow. The forest held its breath, and I found myself doing the same. I looked around anxiously, a creeping sense of dread settling over me. The woods that had always been my sanctuary now felt alien and oppressive. The very air seemed thick with an unseen presence, watching, waiting. Just as the feeling of panic began to overwhelm me, a sudden commotion erupted nearby. A grouse burst from the undergrowth, its loud, startled cackle shattering the unnatural silence. I couldn't help but laugh nervously, relief flooding through me at the break in tension. Trying to shake off the lingering unease, I decided to continue exploring the area. The forest gradually returned to its normal state, the familiar sounds of nature reasserting themselves, but I couldn't entirely rid myself of the feeling that something out of the ordinary had occurred. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, I made my way back home. That night, my sleep was restless, plagued by a nightmare that brought back the unsettling feelings I'd experienced in the woods. In my dream, I found myself staring out of my bedroom window, which overlooked the forest. The darkness seemed to be advancing, pressing against the glass like a living thing. The silhouettes of the trees twisted into sinister shapes, and I could feel eyes watching me from the depths of the shadows. I woke with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. The feeling of being observed lingered, even in the safety of my room. As I lay there, trying to calm my racing thoughts, I made a decision. I needed to go back to the lightning-struck oak. Something was calling me there, and I was determined to find out what it was. The next morning, after a hasty breakfast, I set out once again for the woods. The crisp autumn air filled my lungs as I followed the trail that led to the old oak. The vibrant colors of the changing leaves seemed more intense than ever, as if the forest was trying to put on a show to distract me from my purpose. When I reached the ancient oak, I began to climb its lower branches, enjoying the stretch and pull of my muscles. From my elevated perch, I could see the forest stretching out in all directions, a view that had always brought me peace. But this time, something caught my eye. About 10 feet away, at the base of another tree, lay an odd shape. My heart began to race as I fumbled for the binoculars I'd brought with me. As I focused the lenses, what I saw made my blood run cold. The figure appeared to be humanoid, but with features that were decidedly inhuman. It wore what looked like a tattered military uniform, but its limbs were too thin, too long, ending in broad, almost webbed feet. Its skin was a sickly yellowish green, with a rough, scaly texture that reminded me of a lizard. But it was the creature's face that truly terrified me. It was smooth and hairless, dominated by enormous black eyes that seemed to take up most of its head. Those dark, fathomless eyes were staring directly at me, seeming to look through me. The creature had a small, narrow mouth, and as I watched, it opened slightly, revealing yellowed, sharp teeth. Its long, thin fingers ended in claws that looked equally capable of tearing flesh or manipulating delicate objects. I felt frozen in place, unable to tear my gaze away from those penetrating eyes. The creature showed no signs of aggression, but there was an overwhelming sadness in its posture. As it curled in on itself, I noticed that it appeared to be injured. A greenish fluid that I assumed was its blood was staining its uniform. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. Then, slowly, the creature closed its eyes and became still. I don't know how long I sat there, my heart pounding in my ears, before I finally found the courage to move. With shaking limbs, I carefully climbed down from the tree, making sure to give the creature a wide berth. As soon as my feet hit the ground, I ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, my mind reeling with questions and fears. When I reached home, I knew I couldn't just leave things as they were. Whatever I had seen was real, and it was injured. Despite my fear, I felt a strange sense of responsibility. I grabbed a first aid kit and an old camera, realizing with frustration that I'd left my good camera up in the tree in my haste to escape. I raced back to the spot as quickly as I could, but when I arrived, the creature was gone. The only evidence that remained was a perfect circle of scorched earth and smoldering vegetation. I took photos of the burned area, desperate for some proof of what I had witnessed. As I stood there, staring at the circle of charred ground, my mind raced with possibilities. Had the creature landed here last night, causing my nightmares? Had it come looking for me? Was I the only human who had encountered this being? The questions swirled in my mind, leaving me dizzy with uncertainty and a growing sense of curiosity that began to overshadow my fear. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the memory of those alien eyes staring into mine. I found myself spending hours researching, digging through local legends and folklore, searching for any mention of similar sightings in the area. To my surprise, I discovered that I wasn't alone in my experience. Local legends spoke of creatures that appeared in the forests, described variously as green guardians or forest spirits. While many of these stories were dismissed as myths or the ramblings of overactive imaginations, I couldn't ignore the similarities to what I had seen. One particular account caught my attention. It was from an old journal written by a settler in the late 1800s. He described encountering a man-like creature with skin like the bark of a tree and eyes as deep as the night sky. The settler had been lost in the woods for days when the creature appeared, leading him to a stream and then vanishing without a trace. Another story, more recent, came from a group of hikers in the 1970s. They claimed to have seen a tall, thin being with green skin watching them from the trees. When they tried to approach it, it seemed to melt into the forest, leaving behind only a faint, sweet odor like decaying leaves. These accounts, while intriguing, didn't provide any concrete answers, but they did fuel my determination to understand what I had seen. I began spending more time in the woods, always returning to the spot where I had encountered the creature. The circle of scorched earth remained barren, a stark reminder that what I had experienced was real. As weeks turned into months, I developed a routine. Every day after work, I would head into the forest, camera in hand, hoping to catch another glimpse of the mysterious being. I set up trail cameras, carefully hidden among the trees, their lenses focused on the area where I had seen the creature. Most nights, I would return home empty-handed, with nothing but the usual forest sounds and movements captured on my cameras, but occasionally there would be something different. A shadow that didn't quite match the surrounding trees, a flash of movement too quick and fluid to be a deer or bear, and once, a pair of glowing eyes staring directly into the camera lens, gone in the next frame. These tantalizing glimpses kept me going, even as friends and family began to worry about my growing obsession. They couldn't understand why I was spending so much time in the woods, why I jumped at every unexplained sound, why my eyes constantly darted to the tree line as if expecting something to emerge. How could I explain to them what I had seen? How could I describe the mix of fear and wonder I had felt when those alien eyes met mine? I knew they would think I was crazy, so I kept my experiences to myself, retreating further into my solitary quest for answers. As the months wore on, I began to notice subtle changes in the forest. The animals seemed more alert, their behavior more erratic. Birds would suddenly fall silent, their songs cut off mid-chirp. Deer would freeze, their ears twitching, before bolting for no apparent reason. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, on a chilly autumn evening, almost exactly a year after my first encounter, it did. I was sitting at the base of the lightning-struck oak, my back against its rough bark, when I felt it. A change in the air, a shift in the very fabric of the forest. The birds fell silent, the wind died, and that same oppressive stillness I had felt a year ago descended upon the woods. My heart began to race, and I slowly stood up, my eyes scanning the deepening shadows between the trees. And then I saw it. At first it was just a shimmer in the air, like heat rising from hot pavement. But as I watched, the shimmer coalesced into a form, tall and thin, with that same yellowish-green skin I remembered, those huge black eyes fixed on me, unblinking. I stood frozen, my camera forgotten in my hand, as the creature took a step towards me. Its movements were fluid, almost graceful, despite its odd proportions. As it drew closer, I could see details I had missed in our first encounter. Its skin wasn't just scaly, but seemed to shift and change color slightly, blending with its surroundings. The tattered uniform it wore was adorned with strange symbols I couldn't begin to decipher. When it was just a few feet away, the creature stopped. We stood there, facing each other in the gathering twilight, two beings from different worlds trying to bridge an impossible gap. Slowly, deliberately, it raised one long-fingered hand, palm out, in what I interpreted as a gesture of peace. Swallowing hard, I mirrored the gesture, my hand shaking slightly as I raised it. The creature's eyes seemed to soften, the sadness I had noticed before becoming more pronounced. And then, to my utter astonishment, it spoke. The sound wasn't like anything I had ever heard before. It was a series of clicks and whistles, interspersed with deep, rumbling tones that I felt more than heard. But somehow, impossibly, I understood. "We have watched your kind for a long time," the creature said, its thoughts forming in my mind, even as the strange sounds reached my ears. "You are young, but growing quickly. Too quickly, perhaps." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. What could I possibly say to this being? How could I represent all of humanity in this moment? The creature seemed to sense my struggle. It tilted its head slightly, in an oddly human gesture of curiosity. "You are not afraid," it said, and I realized with surprise that it was true. My initial fear had given way to a sense of wonder and curiosity that matched the creature's own. "No," I finally managed to say. "I'm not afraid. I have so many questions." A sound emerged from the creature that I can only describe as laughter, though it was unlike any laughter I had ever heard. "Of course you do," it said. "Your kind always does. But answers must be earned, not given freely. You have taken the first step by seeking us out. Now you must decide if you are ready for what comes next." As it spoke, I noticed a faint glow emanating from its chest. The glow grew brighter, pulsing in rhythm with its words. I found myself drawn to it, my hand unconsciously reaching out. The creature made no move to stop me as my fingers drew closer to the light. As I touched it, a jolt of energy surged through me. Images flashed through my mind. Vast cities unlike anything on Earth, beings of light and energy, stars and galaxies spinning in the void. I saw the history of my planet, from its fiery birth to a future I couldn't comprehend. And through it all, I sensed the presence of these beings, watching, guiding, protecting. When the vision faded, I found myself on my knees, gasping for breath. The creature stood over me, its hand gently resting on my shoulder. "You have seen a glimpse of the truth," it said, "but there is so much more to learn. Are you willing to take that journey?" I looked up into those fathomless eyes, my mind reeling from what I had experienced. In that moment, I knew that my life would never be the same. Whatever path lay ahead, whatever dangers or wonders it might hold, I knew I had to follow it. "Yes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm ready." The creature nodded, a gesture so human it almost made me laugh. "Then we will begin," it said. And with that, it turned and began to walk deeper into the forest. Without hesitation, I got to my feet and followed. As we moved through the darkening woods, the trees seemed to part before us, revealing a path I had never seen before. The air hummed with energy, and I could feel the weight of ancient knowledge pressing in around me. I didn't know where this path would lead, or what I would find at the end of it. But I knew that I was on the verge of discovering truths about our universe and ourselves that would change everything. And so, with each step into the unknown, I left behind the world I had known. The forest that had been my sanctuary since childhood now became a gateway to something far greater. Whatever lay ahead, I was ready to face it, to learn, to understand. As the last traces of sunlight faded from the sky, I took one final look back at the life I was leaving behind. Then, taking a deep breath, I turned and followed the creature into the depths of the forest and into a future I could never have imagined. As we ventured deeper into the forest, the world around me began to change in subtle yet unmistakable ways. The trees grew taller and more ancient, their gnarled trunks twisting into impossible shapes. Bioluminescent fungi pulsed with an otherworldly glow, casting eerie shadows that danced across our path. The very air seemed charged with energy, tingling against my skin like static electricity. The creature moved silently ahead of me, its form shimmering and blending with the surrounding forest. I found myself struggling to keep up, my human limitations becoming painfully apparent in this alien environment. Just as I was about to call out for a rest, the being stopped abruptly. We had reached a clearing unlike anything I had ever seen. A perfect circle of grass, untouched by tree or stone, lay before us. In the center stood a structure that defied description, a swirling mass of light and energy that seemed to bend the very fabric of reality around it. "This is the Nexus," the creature said, its thoughts resonating in my mind. "A gateway between worlds, between dimensions. It is through here that we have watched your kind, and it is through here that you will learn the truths you seek." I stared at the Nexus, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. Will I be able to come back?" I asked, suddenly realizing the magnitude of what I was about to do. The creature turned its massive eyes towards me, and I sensed a mixture of compassion and amusement in its gaze. "Time and space work differently beyond the Nexus," it explained. "What may seem like years to you might be mere moments here, or vice versa. But yes, you will be able to return, though you may find that you are not the same person who left." Taking a deep breath, I nodded. "I understand. I'm ready." With a gesture that seemed almost ceremonial, the creature beckoned me towards the Nexus. As we approached, the swirling energies intensified, and I felt a pull unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was as if every atom in my body was being drawn towards the gateway. "Remember," the creature's voice echoed in my mind as we stepped into the light, "what you are about to see and learn is but a fraction of the universe's mysteries. Keep an open mind and trust in your ability to adapt." And with that, we crossed the threshold. The sensation was indescribable. It felt as if I was being unmade and remade simultaneously, my consciousness expanding to fill infinite space and then contracting to a single point. Colors I had no names for flashed before my eyes, and sounds beyond human hearing filled my ears. When the disorientation finally passed, I found myself in a place that stretched the boundaries of my imagination. We stood on what appeared to be a platform of pure energy, suspended in a vast expanse of swirling galaxies and nebulae. Beings of light and shadow moved around us, their forms constantly shifting and changing. "Welcome," my guide said, "to the Observation Nexus. It is from here that we monitor the development of countless species across the universe." As my eyes adjusted to the cosmic vista before me, I began to make out what looked like screens or windows floating in the space around us. Each one showed a different world, a different species at various stages of evolution and development. "Your Earth," the creature said, gesturing to one of the nearest windows, "is but one of many worlds we observe. You are not alone in the universe, but you are unique, as is every species we watch over." I approached the window showing Earth, marveling at the view of my home planet from this impossible vantage point. "Why?" I asked, turning back to my guide. "Why do you watch us? Why reveal yourselves to me?" The being's form shimmered, and for a moment I thought I saw a smile on its alien features. "We watch because we were once like you," it explained. "Eons ago, our species faced the same challenges, the same questions about our place in the universe. We evolved, we grew, and eventually we transcended the limitations of our physical forms. Now, we serve as guardians and guides for emerging species across the cosmos. We do not interfere directly, but we do nudge when necessary. Your encounter with me in the forest was one such nudge. You were chosen because of your open mind and your deep connection to the natural world." As I listened, trying to wrap my mind around the enormity of what I was being told, another being approached us. This one was different from my guide, a swirling mass of energy that pulsed with an inner light. "This is the Elder," my guide explained, They will show you what you need to see. The elder's presence filled my mind, and suddenly I was no longer standing in the observation nexus. Instead, I found myself hurtling through time and space, witnessing the birth and death of stars, the formation of galaxies, the emergence of life on countless worlds. I saw Earth as it was billions of years ago, watched as single-celled organisms evolved into complex life forms. I witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations long lost to history, some eerily similar to our own, others utterly alien. But it wasn't just Earth's history I was seeing. The Elder showed me other worlds, other species facing challenges similar to humanity's. I saw civilizations on the brink of destroying themselves through war or environmental catastrophe, only to pull back at the last moment and ascend to new levels of understanding and cooperation. I witnessed the birth of artificial intelligences that partnered with their creators to explore the cosmos. I saw beings of pure energy colonizing the hearts of stars, and silicon-based life forms that lived on timescales of millions of years. Through it all, I sensed the guiding presence of beings like my alien companion, watching, occasionally intervening in subtle ways, but always allowing each species to chart its own course. As the vision subsided, I found myself back in the observation nexus, my mind reeling from the cosmic journey I had just experienced. The Elder's presence receded, leaving me alone with my original guide. What am I supposed to do with all of this?" I asked, my voice shaking. "How can I possibly comprehend everything I've seen?" The creature placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "You are not meant to understand it all at once," it said gently. "What you have experienced is a gift, a glimpse of the true nature of reality and your place within it. How you use this knowledge is up to you." I nodded slowly, still trying to process the enormity of what I had witnessed. "Will I remember all of this when I return?" "Not in the way you might expect," the being explained. "The details will fade, like the memory of a dream, but the essence of what you've learned will remain, influencing your actions and decisions in ways you may not even realize." As we spoke, I noticed that the nexus around us was beginning to shift and change. The windows showing other worlds began to fade, and I felt a familiar pull, the call of Earth, of home. "It is time for you to return," my guide said. "Remember, you carry within you now a spark of cosmic awareness. Use it wisely and trust in the journey ahead." Before I could respond, the swirling energies of the nexus enveloped us once more. The sensation of unmaking and remaking washed over me, and I closed my eyes, surrendering to the process. When I opened them again, I found myself back in the forest clearing where our journey had begun. The first rays of dawn were just beginning to filter through the trees, and for a moment I wondered if any time had passed at all. But as I looked around, I realized that everything had changed. The forest, once simply a place of childhood memories and recent mystery, now pulsed with an energy I could feel in every fiber of my being. The trees, the earth beneath my feet, even the air itself, all were connected in ways I had never before imagined. I turned to my alien guide, 1,000 questions on the tip of my tongue, but the being was already beginning to fade from view. "Remember," its voice echoed in my mind one last time, "you are not alone. We are always watching, always guiding in our own way. The path ahead is yours to choose, but know that it is part of something far greater than you can imagine." And with that, the creature vanished, leaving me alone in the clearing as the new day dawned. As I made my way back home, my mind still reeling from the cosmic journey I had experienced, I knew that my life would never be the same. The knowledge I had gained, the visions I had seen, they would shape every decision, every interaction from this point forward. I also knew that I couldn't share the full extent of what I had learned with anyone else. Who would believe me? How could I possibly explain the vastness of the universe, the interconnectedness of all things, the subtle guidance of ancient, evolved beings? Instead, I decided that I would have to find a way to use this knowledge, this cosmic awareness, to make a difference in my own small corner of the universe. Perhaps, in time, I could help guide humanity towards a future as bright and limitless as the one I had glimpsed beyond the Nexus. As I stepped out of the forest and saw my house in the distance, I took one last look back at the trees that had been my gateway to the cosmos. For a moment, I thought I saw a shimmer in the air, a hint of that otherworldly presence that had changed my life forever. Smiling to myself, I turned and walked towards home, ready to begin the next chapter of my journey, a journey that I now understood was part of something far greater than I could have ever imagined. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, I found myself grappling with the enormity of what I had experienced. The memory of my cosmic journey began to fade, just as my alien guide had predicted, but its impact on my life was undeniable. I started to see the world through new eyes. The interconnectedness of all things, once a vague philosophical concept, became a tangible reality to me. I could sense the subtle energies flowing through the earth, the trees, and even the people around me. It was as if I had been given a pair of glasses that allowed me to see a hidden layer of reality that had always been there, just beyond our normal perception. At first, I struggled to maintain a sense of normalcy in my daily life. How could I focus on mundane tasks when I knew the vastness of the universe and the cosmic dance of countless civilizations? But gradually, I began to understand that this was precisely the point, to bring that cosmic awareness into every aspect of my existence, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. I started making changes in my life, guided by the insights I had gained. I became more environmentally conscious, understanding now more than ever the delicate balance of our ecosystem and its place in the greater cosmic order. I volunteered for local conservation efforts, helping to preserve the very forests that had been my gateway to the stars. My relationships with others deepened as well. The knowledge that we were all part of something greater gave me a newfound empathy and patience. I found myself listening more, judging less, and always looking for the hidden connections that bound us all together. But it wasn't always easy. There were nights when the weight of what I knew seemed overwhelming. I would lie awake, staring at the stars through my bedroom window, feeling both infinitesimally small and cosmically significant at the same time. In those moments, I would close my eyes and reach out with my mind, trying to recapture that sense of universal harmony I had experienced in the observation nexus. As time passed, I began to notice subtle changes in the world around me. It was nothing dramatic, no sudden leaps in technology or overnight shifts in human consciousness, but there was a growing awareness, a collective stirring that I could sense in the people I encountered. More and more I heard people talking about interconnectedness, about our place in the universe, about the need for global cooperation to face the challenges ahead. It was as if humanity as a whole was beginning to wake up to the reality I had glimpsed beyond the Nexus. I couldn't help but wonder if this was the result of other nudges from our cosmic guardians. Were there others like me out there, quietly influencing the course of human development based on the knowledge they had gained? The thought both excited and humbled me. One crisp autumn evening, almost exactly a year after my journey through the Nexus, I felt a familiar pull drawing me back to the forest. As I walked the well-worn path to the clearing where it had all begun, I felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. Would my alien guide be there? Would I be given another opportunity to journey beyond our world? As I stepped into the clearing, I saw that it was empty. No shimmering alien form, no swirling gateway to other dimensions. For a moment I felt a pang of disappointment. But then, as I sat down at the base of the old lightning-struck oak, I realized something profound. The gateway had never really been about the physical location. It wasn't about the clearing or even the alien beings themselves. The true nexus was within me, the cosmic awareness that had been awakened, the connection to the greater universe that I now carried with me always. I closed my eyes and leaned back against the rough bark of the tree. As I did, I felt that familiar sensation of expansion, of my consciousness reaching out beyond the confines of my physical form. In my mind's eye, I saw once again the swirling galaxies, the birth and death of stars, the intricate dance of countless civilizations across the cosmos. But this time, it was different. I wasn't a mere observer, being shown these wonders by an alien guide. I was an active participant, my consciousness merging with the cosmic flow of energy and information. I could feel the subtle influences of the guardian beings, not as external forces, but as an integral part of the universal tapestry. In that moment of cosmic communion, I understood my role more clearly than ever before. I was a bridge, a connection point between the vast, incomprehensible universe and the small, beautiful world of human experience. My task was not to reveal all that I had seen, but to embody that knowledge in my actions, to be a living example of cosmic awareness in everyday life. As I opened my eyes, the forest around me seemed to pulse with renewed vitality. The trees, the earth, the very air, all sang with the music of the spheres, a harmony I could now hear and feel at all times. I stood up, brushing the leaves from my clothes, and began the walk back home. But with each step, I knew that I was carrying the entire universe within me. The journey that had begun a year ago in this forest was far from over. In fact, I realized it was only just beginning. From that day forward, I approached life with a new sense of purpose. I continued my environmental work, but now with a deeper understanding of our planet's place in the cosmic ecosystem. I wrote books and gave talks, not about alien encounters or cosmic journeys, but about the interconnectedness of all things and the potential for human consciousness to expand beyond its current limitations. Some called me a visionary, others dismissed me as a dreamer, but I knew the truth. I was simply a messenger, one of many across the world, helping to guide humanity towards its next stage of evolution. Years passed, and the world continued to change. Slowly but surely, I saw signs of a global shift in consciousness. People were becoming more aware of their connection to each other and to the planet. Nations began to cooperate on unprecedented levels to address global challenges. There was a growing sense of cosmic citizenship, a realization that we were part of something far greater than our individual lives or even our species as a whole. And through it all, I continued to feel the subtle presence of our cosmic guardians, not as distant, all-powerful beings, but as fellow travelers on the grand journey of universal evolution. Their guidance was gentle, their influence subtle, always respecting our free will and our right to chart our own course. As I grew older, I often found myself returning to that forest clearing. Sometimes I would sit for hours, communing with the universe in silent meditation. Other times, I would bring others with me, those who seemed ready to glimpse the greater reality that lay just beyond our normal perception. And sometimes, on rare and precious occasions, I would catch a glimpse of a shimmering form among the trees, or hear the faint echo of that strange, clicking language in my mind. In those moments, I would smile, knowing that the connection forged so long ago remained unbroken. Now, as I near the end of my earthly journey, I look back on the path that began with that first encounter in the woods. The young person who stumbled upon a wounded alien creature seems like a distant memory, almost another lifetime ago. But the cosmic awareness that was awakened in me that day has only grown stronger with time. I don't know what lies beyond this life, what new adventures or challenges await on the other side of the ultimate threshold, but I face the future without fear, knowing that I am and always have been part of something far greater than myself. As I write these words, I can feel the pulse of the universe flowing through me, connecting me to all that is, was, and ever will be. And I know, with a certainty that transcends mere belief, that this is not an ending, but a new beginning. The journey continues across the stars, across dimensions, across the infinite expanse of existence itself. And so, dear reader, I leave you with this. Look to the stars, but also look within. For the greatest frontier, the most wondrous journey, lies not in the vast expanses of outer space, but in the uncharted realms of human consciousness. We are all cosmic explorers, whether we realize it or not. Embrace that role, and you too may find yourself standing at the threshold of the universe, ready to take that first, transformative step into the unknown. The story of humanity's cosmic awakening is still being written, and you are part of that grand narrative. What role will you play? What wonders will you discover? The universe is waiting, in all its infinite mystery and beauty, for you to answer that call. As for me, I prepare for my next great adventure, grateful for the journey that has brought me here, and excited for whatever lies ahead. For I know now more surely than ever that this is not the end, it is only the beginning.
And this was a report. Before we go to the next one, leave your opinion in the comments, we would love to know. Now let's move on to the next one.
My life consisted of exploring underground caves and crevices. I lived an existence full of adrenaline and adventure, which completely distanced me from the monotony of everyday life. But what I saw and lost in that cave destroyed everything I had. That monster took everything from me. I should never have accepted that expedition. But you must know, those things were not of this world. It all began in October 1997. My name is Hans Weber, and I've been exploring the depths of the Earth for over 30 years. Speleology has been my life, an escape and a refuge. I'm no stranger to danger. I've seen things down there that have made other men hang up their helmets forever. But when I received the call from Klaus Müller, something stirred in me. Klaus is a renowned geologist, and what he had found in the Hurlock Cave, in the Schwyz region, seemed to be the opportunity for one last great discovery before age forced me to retire. I knew the rumors. Colleagues spoke of that cave as if it were a death trap. Some never came out again. I wasn't a fool. I knew that accepting this invitation could be the last thing I did. But something in me pushed me to accept. The idea of exploring uncharted territory was irresistible, even for a man like me who has seen too much. What I didn't expect was my son's reaction, Stefan. He and I have never been close. He's ex-military, hardened by years of service, and never understood my passion for caves. When I told him about the expedition, he insisted on coming with me. He said the cave was too dangerous for me to face alone. Reluctantly, I agreed. I knew he was doing it to protect me, not out of love for adventure. We headed towards the cave, with Klaus leading the way. The alpine cold enveloped us as we walked. The air was charged with an ominous sense of stillness. After 6 hours of hiking, we finally reached the entrance of the Hurlock Cave. The landscape was desolate, a sea of rock and ice that seemed to stretch endlessly. Klaus, ever optimistic, suggested we camp right there to rest and prepare for the descent the next day. We were exhausted, but the excitement in his voice was palpable. For him, this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, an expedition that could change his career forever. For me, it was a mixture of anticipation and a growing sense that something wasn't right. With the camp set up, Stefan decided to explore the surroundings a bit. I watched him move away towards the mouth of the cave, his flashlight barely a spark in the darkness. He had always been like this. While I searched the earth for answers to ancient questions, Stefan preferred to face more tangible dangers. What I didn't expect was what he found. That night he returned a couple of hours later with the serious expression he always wore, but this time there was something different in his eyes, as if he had seen something that disturbed him. I asked if everything was all right, and he simply nodded, saying he hadn't found anything to worry about. Later, I would learn about the mutilated bats, cut in a way that didn't seem natural, but at that moment, Stefan decided not to alarm us, perhaps thinking there was already enough tension in the air. The next morning we prepared for the descent. The cave entrance was a dark crack in the rock, a hole that seemed to swallow light. We entered, first Klaus, then me, and finally Stefan, who brought up the rear. As we advanced, it was a maze, a tangle of narrow passages and dark chambers. Klaus, always the scientist, couldn't stop talking about the rock formations we found, pointing to mineral deposits that, according to him, were unique. I tried to focus on the walls and floor, looking for signs of danger, but something kept bothering me. The tunnels didn't seem natural. The walls weren't as irregular as one would expect in such a deep cave. There was something in the way they were arranged, as if someone or something had worked to mold them. Marks on the walls, cuts that seemed too precise to be made by a mere animal. I mentioned it quietly, but I didn't want to worry Klaus, who kept going without noticing the change in the environment. That night, as we camped in a small chamber, I felt an uneasiness I hadn't felt in years. The darkness was dense, almost palpable, and the sounds of the cave, those echoes and creaks that are usually common, seemed closer, more personal. Stefan didn't sleep much. I saw him with his hand near his weapon, his body tense. I tried to rest, but the noises wouldn't stop. It was as if something somewhere deeper in the cave was awake, watching us. The second night in the cave was unsettling, with a constant feeling that we weren't alone. I knew something wasn't right, and Stefan felt it too, but still the next day we pressed on, delving deeper into the belly of the earth, not knowing what awaited us in the depths. We went even further into the cave, leaving behind any trace of natural light. As we advanced, the structure of the tunnels became more complicated. Klaus checked his map and compass constantly, but even he was beginning to admit that we were in uncharted territories. The passages we discovered didn't appear on any map, and what initially seemed to be a well-traced route had become a labyrinth of uncertain paths. It was in one of those tunnels when we found it. The bodies were there, lying on the stone floor, as if they had suddenly dropped dead. But it wasn't death that disturbed me. It was the way they were preserved. Despite the humidity and the time that must have passed, the bodies were surprisingly intact, but mutilated in a way that sent a chill down my spine. The limbs, cut with a precision that no animal could achieve. The faces, frozen in expressions of terror. Stefan was the first to break the silence. His voice was tense when he said we should go back. I couldn't blame him. The scene was chilling even for someone like me, who had seen death up close on more than one occasion. But Klaus, with his growing obsession for discovery, insisted on continuing. For him, these bodies were a sign that we were about to find something big, something no one else had seen. Stefan wasn't convinced. He took me aside, away from Klaus, and warned me that all of this was very wrong. He said that if something happened, he would make sure I was safe, no matter what happened to Klaus. I didn't like the tone in his voice, that tone of contained desperation. I knew he was worried about me, but I also knew he was on the verge of losing patience. We continued, but now it was Stefan who led the group, insisting on going in front. He had become even more vigilant, his hand always near his weapon. As we advanced, The formations on the walls began to change. They were no longer simple mineral deposits, but something more organic. The slabs seemed to pulse with life of their own, and more than once I thought I saw movement at the edges of my vision, something that disappeared when I turned to look at it head-on. And then came the whispers, at first barely perceptible like the hum of wind in the cracks, but soon they became clearer, though unintelligible. It wasn't German or any language I had heard before. They were multiple voices speaking in unison, in a language that didn't belong to this world. Stefan, visibly disturbed, pulled out his weapon, saying he wouldn't let his guard down from that moment on. Finally, we reached a chamber illuminated by a natural water source. The place glowed with a dim, almost magical light that came from the water itself, as if it was impregnated with some kind of fluorescent material. While Klaus and I observed the source in amazement, Stefan stopped us, insisting that we stay at the entrance while he inspected the area. First, I saw him disappear into the darkness for a moment that felt eternal to me. When he returned, his face was pale, his eyes wide, as if he had seen a ghost. In his hands he carried a kind of carapace, a hard, segmented structure that seemed to have been left behind by a creature. It was huge, almost the size of a man, and had a texture unlike anything I had seen before. It looked as if the creature had shed its skin, something Stefan compared to cicadas. "We have to leave," he said, his voice sharp. "Whatever left this behind is further ahead. We're not prepared to face it." But Klaus, in his stubbornness, refused. He was determined to continue, to see with his own eyes what was about to be discovered. Stefan didn't want to hear reasons, but he knew his priority was to protect me. He suggested we take another path, one that wasn't the course of the water. I don't know if it was his tone of voice or the fear in his eyes, but we agreed. We changed route, moving away from the bright source, although I couldn't get out of my head that somehow we were being led towards what was waiting for us, and whatever was up ahead knew we were approaching. We went deeper into the cave. Each step was heavier than the last. The air became dense, and the darkness, despite our flashlights, seemed to have a life of its own, enveloping you. I was alert, much more than usual. I noticed him tense, his movements more cautious, walking ahead of us, his eyes scrutinizing every shadow, every corner. Suddenly, he stopped dead in his tracks. I saw him raise a hand, asking us for silence. At first, I didn't understand what had alarmed him, but then, in the absolute silence of the cave, I heard it too. Soft noises, as if something small and light was moving around us. They were footsteps, but I couldn't see anything. My eyes tried to penetrate the darkness, but there was nothing visible beyond the reach of our flashlights. The sound grew louder, as if whatever was causing it was getting closer. Suddenly, a loud thump resonated behind us. We turned quickly, and there, at the edge of the beam of our flashlights, was the creature. I don't know how to describe it justly. Its skin was a dark grey, almost black, and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It had 6 legs, each ending in sharp claws at least 6 inches long. What disturbed me the most was its huge mouth, full of teeth that seemed to move as if they were constantly grinding something. It didn't seem to have visible eyes, but it was clearly looking at us, as if it could see us in some other way. It emitted a sound that wasn't exactly a roar, but a constant low murmur, like a muffled growl that made my skin crawl. Stefan didn't hesitate for a second. "Back!" he shouted, as he pushed Klaus and me backwards. He pulled out his gun and a machete he carried in his backpack. The first shot echoed in the cave, the echo prolonging in the tunnels. The bullet hit the creature's head, and it let out a sharp screech, staggering, but it didn't fall. Instead, it lunged at Stefan, its legs scratching the stone floor as it launched itself at him with a speed I didn't expect. Stefan fired again at the head, without missing. The creature staggered, Its movements became clumsy, and before it could recover, Stefan dealt it a precise blow. With the machete at the base of the neck, the creature's head came off, and it finally fell to the ground motionless. We stood there, breathing heavily, trying to process what had just happened. We thought it was all over, but from the top of the cave, another of the creatures appeared. Without hesitation, it lunged at Klaus. It was so fast I barely had time to react. The creature grabbed him with its claws and, in a brutal movement, dug them into his chest. Klaus didn't have time to scream. He just let out a choked groan before the creature dragged him towards a tunnel high up in the cave. I didn't scream, but it was too late. Klaus had disappeared into the darkness. Stefan, clearly upset, grabbed my arm. "We have to get out of here now, Dad," he said. The urgency in his voice left no time for argument. We knew our lives depended on every second. We headed towards the exit of the cave, but when we got there, two of those horrible creatures were waiting for us. They were standing in the middle of the path, emitting that low and chilling roar, as if they were challenging us to approach. Stefan, already knowing what was going to happen, gripped the gun and machete he carried tightly. "I'm not afraid of them," he said aloud, more to himself than to me. "I'm going to kill them all without hesitation." The first creature lunged directly at Stefan. He was faster, shooting at the creature's head. The shot stunned it, causing its speed to decrease, but didn't stop it. Taking advantage of the moment, Stefan ran towards it, raising the machete and dealing a devastating blow to the middle of its head. The creature fell to the ground, dead, but there was no time to celebrate. The second creature began to move sideways, dodging the shots Stefan was firing at discretion. Some bullets impacted its body, but it seemed to not affect it in the least. Just as Stefan finished emptying the magazine, the creature leaped at him with brutal force, trapping his arm with its mouth and scratching him with its sharp claws. Stefan screamed in pain but didn't give up. With all the strength he had left, he managed to plunge the machete into the creature's throat, twisting the blade until he was sure it was dead. The beast fell heavily on him, immobilizing his injured arm. I ran towards him and, without hesitation, helped remove the creature's corpse from on top of his body. But just at that moment, we heard that loud screech that the creatures emitted, a sound that resonated on the walls of the cave, louder and closer than before. Stefan, despite the evident pain, got up quickly, ready to keep fighting. Without wasting a second, I took a bandage from my backpack and began to wrap it around Stefan's injured arm. "You have to resist, son," I told him, trying to sound stronger than I felt. "I'm fine, Dad," he replied, though his voice trembled with pain. "Come on, we have to get out of here." We both left the cave and decided to go back the same way we had come in. It was the fastest way out, and we knew the path. But we knew those creatures could be waiting for us around any corner. We arrived again at the place where the strange spring of water was that still glowed with that unreal light. Stefan suddenly stopped and took an explosive that looked like dynamite from his backpack. "Why did you bring that?" I asked, terrified. "In case there was a cave-in and we got trapped," he replied as he prepared the explosive. "But now I'll use it to trap those creatures down here." We advanced a bit more until we no longer heard the creatures behind us. Stefan proceeded to place the explosive at the entrance of one of the tunnels, carefully preparing the detonator. Just as he was finishing, in a moment of carelessness, one of the creatures lunged at me from the darkness, digging its sharp claws into my left shoulder and biting my arm with a force that made me scream in pain. Stefan, without hesitation, shot at the creature, hitting its head with a bullet that made it retreat. Despite his wound, Stefan ran towards me, helped me to my feet, and handed me the detonator. "Dad, you have to get out of here now. Count to 20 and detonate the charge. Don't worry about me, just go." The pain and fear clouded my mind, but I knew there was no other choice. I nodded with difficulty, starting to move away, but just as I was about to leave, I watched in horror as another creature jumped on Stefan from behind, knocking him to the ground and digging its claws into his body. "Dead!" was the last thing he shouted before the creature's roar drowned out his words. With a broken heart and tears blurring my vision, I pressed the button. The explosion resonated in the cave, closing the tunnel and burying my son along with the creature under tons of debris. I had lost him, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to get out and make sure his sacrifice hadn't been in vain. I left the cave staggering. Each step I took was a reminder of the pain in my arm and the loss of Stefan. I knew there was nothing more I could do for him, but the weight of what had just happened crushed me. The cave, now sealed by the cave-in, concealed the horrors we had found inside. No one would ever know the truth, and part of me wondered if that was for the best. I walked for what seemed like hours, getting weaker and weaker, closer and closer to falling. The blood I was losing from my injured arm soaked my clothes, and I felt life abandoning me little by little. Then, in the distance, I saw a group of figures moving. They were campers, a small group that had come to explore the area. They tried to talk to me, to help me, but my senses abandoned me. The last thing I remember is that one of them took me by the shoulders, and then everything went black. I woke up in a hospital with the distant sound of a heart monitor and the smell of disinfectant filling my senses. I was in a bed, covered in bandages, with a dull pain throughout my body. A nurse entered the room and looked at me with concern. "Mr. Weber," she said softly, "you were unconscious for more than 24 hours. You lost a lot of blood, but you're stable. Now there's an investigator who wants to talk to you about what happened in the cave. Do you feel strong enough for that?" I nodded slowly, although every movement reminded me how fragile I was. I knew I would have to face what had happened, but I didn't know how to explain what had really occurred. They wouldn't believe me. No one would. The investigator entered. Shortly after, a man with a stern face and a notebook in his hand sat next to my bed, looking at me with those eyes that seemed to want to unearth the truth. "Mr. Weber," he began, "we know you entered the cave with Dr. Müller and your son Stefan. I'd like you to tell me what happened down there, what occurred with Dr. Müller and your son." The words got caught in my throat. The images of Stefan injured, asking me to detonate the explosive, overwhelmed me. The creatures, the ship, all of that was too much for anyone to believe. So, with a lump in my throat and tears beginning to spring from my eyes, I told him the only story they could accept. "It was a cave-in," I said, my voice breaking. "We were exploring a new section, and suddenly the walls began to give way. Dr. Müller and Stefan, they didn't make it. Thanks to my son, I was able to survive. He saved my life." The investigator wrote something in his notebook, nodding slowly. I knew there was no way to verify what had really happened down there, and in part, I felt relieved that he didn't try. After the investigator left, I was left alone in the room, staring at the ceiling. I knew I would never be the same. The truth of what had occurred in Hurlock Cave would die with me, but the price I paid for that secret was too high. I had lost my son, and with him, any possibility of redemption. That day, my life changed forever. Although I might recover physically, the wound in my soul would never heal. Every night in my dreams I returned to the cave. I heard those whispers and saw Stefan asking me to save him, but it was already too late.
And this was a report. Before we go to the next one, leave your opinion in the comments. We would love to know. Now let's move on to the next one.
I never spoke about this to anyone, and I never will while I'm alive. But this story has to be known someday. If someone is listening to this recording, it means I must have been dead for 30 years. Strange beings kidnapped and tortured me, experimented on my body as if I were an animal. But that wasn't worse than everything I saw, nor worse than what will come in the next century. My name is Michael Schmidt. I'm 38 years old, and I'm a history teacher at a secondary school in Heidelberg, Baden-Württemberg, where I was also born and raised. After inheriting my grandfather's house, who passed away 20 years ago, I've dedicated myself to restoring this family property that dates back to the 1920s. The structure of the house, with its creaking wooden floors and an atmosphere charged with past stories, has always been a place of fascination for me. On a rainy autumn Saturday, I decided to explore the attic, which was full of objects and memories accumulated over the decades. Among piles of old books and faded photographs, I found a dust-covered magnetophone. For those who don't know, a magnetophone is an old device used to record and play sound using a magnetic tape system. After carefully cleaning it, I investigated how I could make it work again. After placing a tape and adjusting the playback mechanisms, which involved manually rewinding the tape and adjusting the reading needle, I finally got it started. My grandfather, Thomas Schmidt, was a prominent figure in my childhood, although a man of few words. I knew well his stories about his work on the West Valley Railway line, but I always had the feeling that there were parts of his life he never shared. When my grandfather Thomas's voice resonated in the attic, clear and surprisingly young, I felt a mixture of nostalgia and awe. The recording, which I expected to be a mere recounting of family events, took an unexpected turn towards the extraordinary and terrifying. My grandfather began to relate an experience from his childhood that had never been revealed to our family. In the recording, my grandfather Thomas Schmidt's young voice begins his account with chilling precision, as if every detail were etched in his memory. "My name is Thomas Schmidt, and what I'm going to tell you happened when I was just 10 years old. No child should have seen what I saw. I grew up in Heidelberg, Baden-Württemberg, in a quiet family, and until that day my life had been like that of any other child. Everything changed on a work trip with my father, Samuel Schmidt, a freight contractor who worked for the West Valley Railway line. Our destination was Munich, Bavaria. What should have been a routine trip to transport minerals and industrial supplies became the worst experience of my life. It was September 15th, 1930, in the midst of the Great Depression. The crisis had hit the entire country, and our railway line was on the verge of collapse, struggling to survive. Our train entered the Black Forest, a dangerous stretch we knew well, but which that day had something different, something that foreshadowed disaster. When we began to climb through the valley pass, the sky suddenly changed. It was as if someone had turned off the sun. An electric blue expanded across the horizon, and before we knew it, a violent storm broke out over us. The conductor tried to reduce speed when the first signs of the storm appeared, but it was useless. Suddenly, a monstrous lightning bolt descended from the clouds and struck our locomotive. Everything turned to chaos. Sparks flew through the air and the train came to a halt. I remember the sound as if 1,000 knives were tearing the sky while the train wobbled. Another lightning bolt struck the nearby mountains, causing a rock slide. The stones, huge as claws of an invisible beast, hurled themselves at us. There was no time to react. The train, out of control, crashed into the rocks. The impact was brutal. The metal twisted with a crunch that I can still hear in my head. The glass shattered into 1,000 pieces. Screams of terror and pain filled the air. I looked around and all I saw was destruction, motionless bodies and blood. At that moment, as dust and smoke enveloped us, I knew nothing would ever be the same. Of the 25 passengers on board, 10 had died instantly. Their lifeless and disfigured bodies could barely be recognized among the debris and the twisted structure of the train. The other 15, including my father and me, had survived, but we were injured. Screams of pain, desperation, and confusion filled the cold mountain air, creating an atmosphere that seemed to worsen with each passing second. Some passengers, less injured, began to organize themselves. They tried to free the buried part of the locomotive, digging through the remains and looking for some way to call for help. The cold seeped into our bones, but before we could even understand the magnitude of our situation, something else happened, something that defied all logic. Suddenly, a white light, pure and radiant, began to make its way through the stormy clouds. It was so intense that we were all forced to close our eyes or look away. But that light was not like the sun or lightning. It had a different, strange origin. We didn't know it at that moment, but what we were about to see would change our lives forever. Space itself seemed to distort around us, and when I opened my eyes again, there above us, floating in the air, I saw something impossible. A colossal disc-shaped object with a small dome on its upper part emerged from among the clouds like an apparition from another world. It didn't look like anything we had seen before, as if a fragment of another universe had torn our reality, breaking the laws of time and space. But it wasn't just its presence that impacted us. There was something about it, an invisible force that exerted a strange pressure on us. 6 of us, as if we were under the control of an invisible mind, began to float towards the object, unable to resist it. Me, my father, a Lutheran pastor, and his daughter, a freight worker and an engineering student. We were all attracted. I felt as the light grew more intense, as if everything else in the world faded in its glow. My thoughts were confused and fear took over me, but I couldn't stop. We were puppets under the control of an unknown force. And then, in a blinding blink, darkness consumed us. I woke up in a cold place. Everything around me was strange and terrifying. The first thing I noticed was the lack of windows, of air, of anything that connected me to the outside. I found myself in a hermetically sealed room, illuminated by a dim light that barely allowed me to see the outline of the walls. I tried to get up, but something prevented me. My head hit against something invisible and solid. I was trapped in a kind of glass cell. It surrounded me completely. I couldn't get out. My breathing accelerated. Panic dominated me. It was then that I looked around and saw the other 5. My father, the pastor, his daughter, the freight worker, and the engineering student. They were there, but not like me. They lay motionless on stretchers, still unconscious. I didn't understand what was happening. Before I could process it, the doors of the room opened, and then I saw them. These creatures appeared. They were tall, thin, their grotesque bodies covered by interlocking bone plates, giving them the appearance of natural armor. They had no defined facial features, just a small deformed head that seemed out of place compared to their skeletal body. My eyes fixed on their hands, ending in pointed claws that seemed designed to destroy. I felt terror taking over me, and I fainted. When I woke up again, the creatures were there, right in front of me. They seemed to be conversing among themselves, but they didn't speak. They communicated telepathically. Their gestures were slow, methodical, but they emitted no sound. I watched, paralyzed by fear, as one of them pressed a button on a strange device he wore on his arm. Suddenly, the lights in the room intensified, revealing something I hadn't noticed before. The walls of the room were covered by huge incubators, each illuminated from within. I got as close as I could, still inside my invisible prison, to see better what they contained. What I saw chilled my blood. Inside those incubators were humans, people from different eras, some with ancient clothing, others of more modern appearance. The most disturbing thing was their condition. Some were atrophied, while others seemed to be trapped in different stages of human evolution, as if they had been manipulated and altered in horrible ways. They were like failed experiments. What followed was something I'll never forget. The creatures, those deformed beings, began their experiments on us. They treated us like animals, as if we were simple objects for their experiments. They had no compassion, and what they did to us was indescribable. 6 of us had been taken, 3 were subjected to psychic experiments, and the other 3 to physical experiments. The engineering student was one of the first to suffer. I saw it from my glass prison. They opened his head with a scalpel, without anesthesia, without any care. I saw how they introduced technological needles into his brain, piercing his consciousness as if it were a file they could read, modify, or even extract. The pain on his face was indescribable. The freight worker was subjected to something even more macabre. I saw him as they introduced him into a capsule filled with a thick liquid. That liquid began to decompose his body quickly. It was like watching someone disintegrate alive. Then they tried to reconstruct him but failed. They left him as a mass of deformed flesh and bones. Anna Weber, the pastor's daughter, was the one who suffered the most. They mutilated her, cut out her organs, tore them from her body, and then tried to transplant organs from other species. It was as if they were seeking to mix her with something non-human. Anna became a kind of hybrid, a monster that could barely be recognized. She lived in that state for a few days, but eventually died. Her body couldn't withstand the horrible transformation that the creatures imposed on her. Meanwhile, my father, the pastor, and I were assigned for their psychic experiments. They subjected my father and the pastor to mind control. They implanted devices in their brains. I felt that with each passing day, they were losing a part of themselves. They put me in a state of deep sleep. They invaded my consciousness, explored my thoughts, my memories. It was as if they were tearing my soul out. But the worst came later. They tried to make consciousness exchanges, forced the pastor Georg Weber's memories into me. And then I understood everything. I discovered that Georg had helped cause the train accident. He had broken down the locomotive system, facilitating the short circuit. He and Anna had already been abducted before, and Georg had made a desperate pact with the creatures to save his daughter's life, who was already sick from the strange experiments they had been subjected to. In exchange, Georg agreed to help them capture people for their procedures, but the creatures betrayed him in the end, and Anna paid the price. We were around 10 days in that experimentation room, subjected to their whims. Once, I saw the creatures do something that left me breathless. They brought back to life a man who was in one of their incubators. They placed a small patch on his neck, and I saw how he revived, only for them to begin experimenting on him again. At some point during those endless days of torture and experimentation, the creatures began to communicate with me. They didn't speak with words, at least not in the way we do. They transmitted their thoughts directly to my mind. It was as if a wave of voices flooded my head, a cacophony of ideas and sensations that I could barely process. I tried to resist at first, but it was useless. My mind was naked before them. They could read each of my thoughts, my fears, my doubts, but at the same time I could also feel fragments of their thoughts. I filled them with questions. I wanted to understand what they were, what they wanted from us, why they did what they did. And then, in the midst of that telepathic connection, I received the answers that chilled me to the bones. Their purpose was clear. They weren't simply curious beings or alien scientists in search of knowledge. They wanted to manipulate humanity. Their ultimate goal was to completely subjugate our planet, extract its resources, and turn us into their slaves. They saw us as an inferior race, a source of biological material and energy. They called themselves Carnos, an ancient and powerful race whose scientific and technological advances were far ahead of anything we could imagine. They told me that by the beginning of the next millennium, their preparations would be complete. They would have perfected the techniques necessary to take total control of Earth. Their invasion wouldn't be immediate, but gradual, calculated, infiltrating our societies until we were completely theirs. We were nothing more than pieces of their experiment. They were studying our bodies, our minds, our psychic abilities, all in order to create the perfect method to subjugate us. When the time came, the horrors that were only the beginning of what was to come. At the end of it all, when the creatures no longer had any use for us, they decided to get rid of the few of us who remained intact. They threw us among the wreckage of the accident like garbage. When I woke up, I saw that my father and Pastor Georg Weber were dead. They had been discarded like broken objects. I was dying, barely clinging to life, but not completely defeated. I remember their words in my mind. "We're not going to kill you, but you'll die on that mountain. You're weak, and we don't want to dirty our hands with the death of a child." They left me there, lying among the corpses, as if my life was worth nothing. I felt trapped in an endless nightmare. The first thing I did was look at my pocket watch. It was an instinctive reflex, something I did without thinking. I had seen the time just before we were abducted, and when I looked again, I couldn't believe it. Only an hour had passed. Everything we had experienced on that ship, the endless tortures, the days of experiments, the terror, all of that occurred in less than an hour. I couldn't understand it. Time had been manipulated in a way I would never understand. It was as if the real world had continued its course, oblivious to our nightmare. Still in shock, I remembered the reanimation patch I had taken from the ship. I placed it on my father's neck, and as his body reacted, as he slowly came back to life, something in him had changed. He wasn't the same man. The trauma of what we had lived through had broken him. I had changed too. We were nothing but shadows of who we had been. Shortly after, a rescue team arrived at the accident site. They found us among the remains of the train, surrounded by death and destruction. No one believed us when we tried to tell what had happened. For them, we were just survivors of a terrible accident, nothing more. The truth was buried with the bodies and the remains of the train. I'm so traumatized that I can't even talk about this. I've lived with this weight all my life, knowing that they're out there, waiting, but they'll return. Their plan is still in motion, and when they're ready, they'll finally execute their invasion of Earth. Before the middle of the 21st century, they'll be here. No one is prepared for what's coming. I can't stop thinking even today about what I heard. My grandfather's words, his voice loaded with terror and desperation, still resonate in my head. How is it possible that this has been hidden for so long? What do I do now? How can I move forward knowing what I know? They're out there. My grandfather knew it, and now I know it too. I don't know when, but they'll return. He made that clear, and we're not prepared. With trembling legs, I left the attic, trying to leave behind the weight of everything I had heard. The cold air hit my face, but it didn't calm me. Outside, the world went on, oblivious to the threat that loomed over it. I kept my gaze fixed on the sky, as if waiting for a sign, anything that indicated that time was running out. They were already here. I didn't know it, but what I did know from that moment on is that time was running. They'll return. My grandfather had said it clearly. The deadline is before the middle of the 21st century. I know the world isn't prepared to face what's coming. No one is.
And this was a report. Before we go to the next one, leave your opinion in the comments. We would love to know. Now let's move on to the next one.
When I found those files, I knew there was something terribly wrong with the Apollo 10 mission. I had seen many things during my time at ESA, but nothing like this. Those secrets should have stayed buried on the moon, and now, as I watch the shadows in this underground bunker, I feel the weight of what is about to be unleashed. If I had known what I would discover, I never would have accepted that call. I worked for ESA for years. It was my life, what I had always dreamed of. I spent my days between reports, data analysis, and endless meetings about space missions. But there was something else, something that didn't add up. I asked questions that had no answers, questions about certain classified files that always seemed out of my reach. It was 1993 when I pushed too hard. They sidelined me, called it a reassignment. It was an elegant way of saying I was finished for them. They turned me into a pariah in my own field, relegated me to insignificant tasks, far from any relevant research. Rumors spread. People began to avoid me in the hallways. Those who were once colleagues became shadows that looked at me sideways. I ended up resigning, but in reality they fired me without saying it out loud. Years passed, years in which I tried to rebuild my life away from all that, but the resentment grew every day. Then, one night, the phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm, too calm. "We know what they did to you. We want you to know the truth." The guy introduced himself as an infiltrator, someone inside ESA who had seen what no one else had seen. He gave me the coordinates of a secret facility in the Black Forest and told me that I would find answers there. I thought about it for days, almost let it pass, but the anger was stronger. I gathered a small group of people like me, disillusioned and looking for something to hold on to. We headed to that facility, not knowing we were about to face something much worse than the betrayal of a former employer. After years of being relegated to oblivion, of being seen as a shadow in the field where I was once respected, I thought my life had been reduced to an unbearable monotony. But then came that call in the middle of the night. The voice on the other end was cold, almost mechanical. He told me about Apollo 10 and 8, a mission that, according to all official records, never existed. But that voice knew too much. He gave me coordinates and told me about a secret facility in the Black Forest, a place that ESA uses as a facade for technological tests, but which is actually a bunker full of secrets from space expeditions that should never have been unearthed. I couldn't ignore what I heard. Years of resentment and need for redemption were boiling inside me. I contacted Rebecca Miller, a brilliant hacker with a past at ESA who, like me, was betrayed by the same institution she used to idolize. Rebecca had worked at that facility before they removed her from her post for snooping in files that were too sensitive. She also had unfinished business, and when I told her what I had discovered, she didn't hesitate to join. "Are you sure you can hack the security system?" I asked her. "If I manage to get into ESA's servers, this will be child's play," Rebecca replied with a confident smile. Together, we began to plan the infiltration. We knew we needed more hands, and not just anyone. Rebecca contacted Johann Bulldog Hoffman, a mercenary with tactical skills who once worked for ESA, but not in the way people imagine. His job was to make all evidence of unrecognized life disappear, UFOs, extraterrestrial traces. Everything had to be erased from the face of the earth before the press or any civilian could even suspect. Bulldog had seen things that most only dare to imagine, and now, with his life turned into a downward spiral, he was willing to accept any job that would give him a purpose, even a suicidal one. "What's in it for me?" Bulldog asked as he cleaned his weapon. "An opportunity to redeem yourself, to do something worthwhile," I told him, knowing those words would resonate with him. Then there was Dr. Marcus Weber, a former colleague of mine who was still trapped inside ESA. We had grown apart after my fall, but I always assumed he still had doubts, questions he couldn't ask without risking his own career. When I told him about what I had discovered, his silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know. Marcus wanted to help, even if it meant betraying the institution to which he had dedicated his life. "Are you sure about this, Marcus?" I asked, knowing the risk he was taking. "I've never been more sure of anything," he replied with a determination I hadn't seen in years. Eva Schmidt, an independent journalist, was the next to join. Eva had dedicated years to trying to bring to light the truth about UFO sightings and other suspicious ESA activities. Every time one of her stories was ready to be published, something happened. Her sources disappeared, her articles were discredited as mere stories. She was tired of her efforts being in vain, and when I contacted her, I saw in her eyes the same determination I felt inside. Finally, we recruited Leopold Leo Bauer, a retired engineer who had helped build the first lunar facilities. He was unfairly fired after a miscalculation that caused an accident in one of the containment chambers. Leo had been removed from what he loved, and that wound had not yet healed. The opportunity to return, to correct the error that had banished him, was something he could not refuse. "This isn't just for me, it's for everyone who ever believed in what we did," I told him, and he nodded that it was the truth. So, with a team as diverse as it was dangerous, we embarked on a mission that we knew could be our last. The truth was hidden in that bunker in the Black Forest, and we were willing to unearth it no matter the cost. Getting into the facility was easier than we thought, but we knew we were walking on dangerous ground. Rebecca deactivated the security measures from a van we had hidden several kilometers from the base, hidden among the trees. Meanwhile, Johann Bulldog Hoffman used his contacts to have a friend of his who drove supply trucks get us in as part of a food shipment. Nobody questions much when they think you're just carrying groceries for employees at a secret base in the middle of the forest. "Remember, once inside there's no turning back," Bulldog warned us. As we prepared to enter, once inside, the suffocating heat of the forest was replaced by a cold air that made my hair stand on end. The place had changed a lot since the last time Rebecca was there. According to what she had told us, what was once a simple underground bunker was now full of strange technology, as if taken from a science fiction movie, and the guards. There were many more than we expected, all armed to the teeth. Something very important was happening there, something that needed a very high level of security. We waited for the guard change to move. Adrenaline had me on edge. Every noise seemed like a danger. We advanced through the corridors, mentally noting everything strange we saw. The metal walls reflected our distorted shadows, as if the building itself was watching us. Then we saw the containment chambers. They were huge, lined up in a room that seemed to have no end. Inside them, creatures I had never seen. Their bodies were deformed. They looked alien. Seeing them turned my stomach. They were beings that should not exist. But there they were, trapped just a few meters from us. This is impossible," said Marcus, his voice trembling. We went on, looking for the office that Rebecca had identified in the plans. Marcus and Leo took care of opening the door. We found voice recordings, whispers in languages we didn't recognize, but which weren't human. The documents described inhumane experiments, vivisection, endurance tests, attempts to communicate with entities we didn't understand. It became clear that the Apollo 10 and 8 missions were not just a lunar exploration. They had found something on the moon, something that should never have been brought back. As I frantically reviewed the files, Dr. Evelyn Schultz entered the room. Her presence was unsettling, but at that moment we were too focused on the information to notice her attitude. She approached the screen and looked at the recording with an inscrutable expression, as if all of this was not a surprise to her. "They shouldn't have brought this back," Schultz muttered, more to herself than to us. Dr. Schultz began to speak. Her voice was strangely calm. She revealed to us that ESA had had contact with these beings long before Apollo 18. Not only were they capable of understanding us, but they could also speak our language. They were a species so advanced that, according to her, they could ridicule the greatest philosophers on our planet. But there was something in her tone, something that put me on alert. She began to talk about doors that should never have been opened, knowledge that was better left buried. "There are things it's better not to know," she said, her voice sounding increasingly distant as we continued investigating. I noticed that Dr. Schultz was becoming stranger, more distant. She no longer seemed like the ally who had helped us from the beginning. There was a gleam in her eyes that I couldn't decipher, as if she knew something we didn't. She was beginning to show her true nature, and although I didn't want to admit it, I knew something wasn't right. We had opened a Pandora's box, and I was beginning to wonder if we hadn't made a fatal mistake by entering that facility. Finally, we found what we had been looking for. Among the dusty files and old tape recordings, we came across the data from the Apollo 18 mission. We sat around a small screen, anxious and nervous, and began to watch the recording. What we saw left us frozen. The Apollo 18 astronauts had found something on the moon, something no one expected. The camera showed a desolate landscape until, in the distance, a structure appeared. It was a dark, alien temple made of a material we couldn't identify. It didn't belong to this world. The astronauts entered. Their breathing was the only thing that broke the silence. Inside, they found life forms they had never seen, creatures that couldn't be from Earth. The recording became chaotic. The astronauts screamed, the camera shook, and then silence. They disappeared without a trace. At that moment, we understood that ESA had hidden something terrible. The documents we found confirmed our worst fears. ESA had tried to use these creatures to gain an advantage in the Cold War. They wanted to use them as weapons or as a source of superior knowledge. But the project went terribly wrong. Not only could they not control the creatures, but they also caused the disappearance of the lunar team. Dr. Schultz approached the screen and looked at the recording with an inscrutable expression, as if all of this was not a surprise to her. "They shouldn't have brought this back," Schultz muttered, more to herself than to us. Dr. Schultz began to speak. Her voice was strangely calm. She revealed to us that ESA had had contact with these beings long before Apollo 10 and 8. Not only were they capable of understanding us, but they could also speak our language. They were a species so advanced that, according to her, they could ridicule the greatest philosophers on our planet. But there was something in her tone, something that put me on alert. She began to talk about doors that should never have been opened, knowledge that was better left buried. "There are things it's better not to know," she said, her voice sounding increasingly distant as we continued investigating. I noticed that Dr. Schultz was becoming stranger, more distant. She no longer seemed like the ally who had helped us from the beginning. There was a gleam in her eyes that I couldn't decipher, as if she knew something we didn't. She was beginning to show her true nature and, although I didn't want to admit it, I knew something wasn't right. We had opened a Pandora's box, and I was beginning to wonder if we hadn't made a fatal mistake by entering that facility. We thought we had enough evidence to expose the truth. We were ready to leave that facility and take what we had found to the world. But just as we were beginning to pack up the files, the doors burst open and we found ourselves surrounded by the base's security forces. Everything happened in a matter of seconds. They were yelling at us to get down, but Dr. Schultz was still standing, no longer with that ambiguous attitude she had shown until now. She looked cold, distant, and when she opened her mouth, we understood everything. She told us that she had been part of the Apollo 10-8 mission. She was one of the few survivors, and that she had made a dark pact with those creatures on the moon. According to her, that pact had allowed her to maintain her power and position at ESA all these years. "Why?" I asked, feeling everything crumbling. "Because there are things bigger than you and me, things that need control," she replied with a coldness that chilled my blood. Everything had been a trap. She had guided us from the beginning, pretending to be our ally, but her intention had always been to deliver us to the creatures as sacrifices. She said it was the only way to maintain a fragile balance between our world and that of those extraterrestrial entities. My mind could barely process what she was saying. She had led us directly to our own graves. Suddenly, chaos erupted. Johann Bulldog Hoffman, with the fury of a man with nothing to lose, launched himself against the guards. His combat experience was evident, and although he managed to take down several of them, the fight was fierce. Bullets were flying everywhere, bouncing off the metal walls of the bunker. Hoffman faced the security men with everything he had, but it wasn't enough. He received several shots and fell seriously wounded, but not before giving us a chance to try to escape. "Run! It's going to end!" Hoffman shouted as he fell to the ground, covered in blood. As the battle unfolded, another terrifying sound filled the air. The containment chambers of the creatures began to open. The creatures, those things that don't belong to our world, were being released. I could feel terror taking over me, but I also knew there was no time for that. We were trapped between the base security and those entities that shouldn't exist. In the midst of all that chaos, Dr. Schultz watched with cold satisfaction on her face. For her, this was just the fulfillment of her plan. For us, it was a nightmare from which we might not come out alive. There were few of us left. Johann Bulldog Hoffman and Leopold Bauer had fallen, sacrificing themselves to give us one last chance. We were exhausted, wounded, and surrounded by creatures that should never have been released. Dr. Schultz, standing in front of us, looked at us with a mixture of contempt and satisfaction. For her, we were already dead from the moment we crossed the doors of that facility. With a coldness that chilled my blood, Dr. Schultz began to speak. She revealed that ESA had always known about the risks, that they had sacrificed the crews of Apollo 10 and 8 to obtain the alien power that those creatures possessed. Everything had been planned from the beginning. Human lives were a small price to pay for the power and knowledge they sought. "They were pawns just like you," she said, without a trace of remorse. We knew we couldn't reason with her, that she was completely consumed by her pact with those creatures. With a quick movement, she tried to provoke the monsters that were already out of their containment chambers, trying to direct them towards us, seeking to destroy us once and for all. But I wasn't willing to die there, not without fighting to the end. In that moment of desperation, I remembered the smoke grenade I had saved, waiting for the right moment to use it. This was the moment. I dropped it on the floor, and a dense white cloud filled the room. The confusion that followed gave us an opportunity. As Dr. Schultz screamed in fury, trying to control the situation, we ran towards the exit. "Quick, this way!" I shouted, guiding the others towards the only exit left. But she wasn't going to let us escape from the creatures she had unleashed, but the cost was high. Johann Bulldog Hoffman and Leopold Bauer didn't survive. They had given everything they had in that final battle, sacrificing themselves to ensure that those creatures and Dr. Schultz couldn't continue their terror. The facility was in total chaos, and as the few of us left ran for our lives, I couldn't help but feel a bitter mixture of triumph and loss. We had destroyed Dr. Schultz and those unknown beings, but at a price that perhaps wasn't worth paying. We barely managed to escape. Marcus, Ava, and I left that facility wounded and exhausted, but alive. Rebecca, who had been outside monitoring everything, helped us get out at the last moment. We carried with us a device that contained the truth about Apollo 10 and 8 and the creatures they had brought from the moon. We knew that what we had discovered would change everything, but we also knew that our lives would never be the same again. The truth had to come to light, but doing so would put our lives in danger. Still, I decided to try. With Rebecca's help, we sent an encrypted message to several media outlets, hoping that someone, somewhere, would receive it and dare to publish it. But before those messages could reach their destination, they were intercepted by the German intelligence services, ESA, and those who controlled the secrets. They would not allow the truth to come to light so easily. "It can't be," Rebecca murmured upon seeing that the messages hadn't. "It can't be," Rebecca murmured upon seeing that the messages hadn't reached their destination. "We tried. Now we have to prepare for what's coming," I replied. knowing that the worst was yet to come. Over time, one by one, my companions were hunted down. Marcus and Eva both were eliminated to ensure that the truth remained hidden. Rebecca, being outside the facility, managed to stay hidden for longer, but eventually she too was caught. I became the last survivor of our team. I knew it was only a matter of time before they came for me too, but I wasn't going to sit idly by. I've spent years in the shadows, hiding and waiting for the right moment. The world deserves to know what really happened, what ESA has been hiding all this time. The secret has become a whisper, a rumor that can no longer be silenced. And I know that soon, very soon, that terrible secret will come to light, revealing what many suspect, but few dare to believe. They can't hide this forever, I whispered to myself, preparing for what I had to do. I can't say how much longer I'll be able to stay hidden, but one thing is certain: what I found, what we discovered in that facility, will be revealed. The truth is imminent, and, when it comes to light, there will be no way to stop it. As I sit here in this dimly lit room in Berlin, I can't help but think about how it all started. The weight of the truth we uncovered in that Black Forest facility still haunts me. Every shadow seems to hide a threat. Every unexpected sound makes me jump. But I can't let fear paralyze me. Not now, when we're so close to exposing everything. I've been moving from city to city across Germany, never staying in one place for too long. Hamburg, Munich, Frankfurt. Each offered temporary refuge, but nowhere feels safe anymore. I've learned to blend in, to become just another face in the crowd. But I know they're still looking for me, the same people who silenced my friends, who would do anything to keep their secrets buried. Last week, I thought I saw Dr. Schultz in a busy street in Cologne. For a moment our eyes met, and I felt that same cold dread I experienced in the facility. But when I looked again, she was gone. Was it really her, or is paranoia finally getting the better of me? I can't be sure anymore. The device we took from the facility, the one containing all the evidence, has become both my lifeline and my greatest burden. I've made copies, hidden them in secure locations across the country. If anything happens to me, the truth will still find its way out. It has to. I've been trying to make contact with journalists, whistleblowers, anyone who might be willing to listen and brave enough to act. But it's a dangerous game. How can I know who to trust when the enemy seems to have eyes and ears everywhere? Sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if it was all worth it. The lives lost, the sacrifices made. But then I remember the horrors we saw in that bunker, the implications of what ESA has been hiding, and I know we had no choice. The world needs to know, no matter the cost. I've started compiling all our findings into a comprehensive report. It's risky, but necessary. If I disappear, at least there will be a record, a testament to what we discovered and what it could mean for humanity. The thought that this might be my legacy both terrifies and motivates me. There are nights when I dream of the moon, of that alien structure we saw in the Apollo 18 footage. In these dreams, I'm there, walking on the lunar surface, approaching the dark temple. But as I get closer, I always wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of otherworldly whispers still ringing in my ears. I've tried to rationalize what we saw, to find some logical explanation that doesn't involve extraterrestrial life forms making pacts with our space agencies, but the evidence is overwhelming. The creatures in those containment chambers, the advanced technology, the lengths ESA has gone to keep it all hidden. It all points to a truth almost too fantastic to believe. Yet, amidst all this darkness, there's a glimmer of hope. I've started noticing subtle changes in public discourse. More people are asking questions, challenging official narratives about our space programs. It's as if, on some subconscious level, humanity is preparing itself for the revelation that's to come. I know my time might be running out. Each day could be my last. But I'm determined to see this through. The truth about Apollo 10 and 8, about what's really out there in space, and what our governments have been hiding, it all needs to come to light. As I finish writing this account, I can hear footsteps in the hallway outside my room. Heavy, purposeful steps. My heart races as I quickly save this document and prepare to run again. But even if they catch me this time, it's too late. The wheels are in motion. The truth is out there, scattered across Germany, waiting to be found. And when it finally comes to light, the world will never be the same again.
And this was a report. Before we go to the next one, leave your opinion in the comments. We would love to know. Now let's move on to the next one.
What you're about to hear should never have come to light. I can't reveal my name or show my face, for my own safety and yours. What I'm about to tell you is something that NASA, the United States government, and an entity I'd rather not name have kept in the shadows for decades. That recent news, the one that mentioned the discovery of a rock called Shergotite on Mars, it's a complete fabrication. NASA made it up to distract humanity, to cover up something much darker that they don't want anyone to know about. Mars isn't just a dead desert. It's inhabited, and I'm not talking about microbes or fossils. I'm talking about a race of beings that we should never have discovered. But don't misunderstand me. My purpose isn't to warn you about a simple conspiracy, but to reveal a truth so disturbing that once you know it, there's no going back. For over 30 years, I worked as an aerospace engineer at NASA. I spent more time surrounded by cables, screens, and space transmissions than with my own family. My days started early, before the sun peeked over the horizon. I'd arrive at the facilities, nod a greeting to the security guards, and walk down the long corridors to my office, where an endless succession of data awaited me. Reviewing transmissions, analyzing readings, interpreting images, that was my world. Many envied my position, but I felt something was deeply wrong. The interactions with my colleagues were brief, formal, almost mechanical. We talked about ongoing projects, discussed the progress and expectations of missions, but we rarely deviated from the script. There was an atmosphere of secrecy that enveloped everything, a kind of invisible barrier that no one dared to cross. We knew how far we could ask, how far we could inquire. It was as if we were all actors in a play, following a script we couldn't alter. But it was precisely in that routine, in that constant repetition, where I began to notice the first signs that something didn't fit. The transmissions from Mars had always been our direct connection with the rover. Images, atmospheric data, chemical analyses, everything came through those transmissions. For years, I had reviewed that data without questioning its authenticity. But then the anomalies began to appear, small cuts in the transmissions that had no logical explanation, readings that vanished from the records as if they had never existed, images that seemed to have been manipulated, edited to hide something. At first I thought they were technical errors, system failures, natural interference. But the more I reviewed them, the clearer it became that they weren't failures. They were deliberate omissions, subtle manipulations that only someone with years of experience could detect. And the most disturbing thing was that no one else seemed to notice, or if they did, they preferred to keep quiet. What was really happening on Mars? Why was there information that seemed to be deliberately hidden? It was during one of those routine reviews when it happened. I was reviewing a set of images sent by the rover, landscapes of Martian valleys and rocks that at first glance didn't seem to contain anything out of the ordinary. I was passing one image after another with almost automatic efficiency, until one of them made me stop dead in my tracks. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the more I looked at the image, the clearer it became. There, on the ancient horizon, right at the edge of the frame, was a figure. It wasn't a rock or a shadow created by the sunlight. It was something else, something vaguely humanoid. The shape was slender, taller than an average human, and was covered by what appeared to be an exoskeleton similar to an insect's shell. The figure was standing still, looking towards the horizon, as if observing something in the distance. My heart began to race. I knew I wasn't seeing a simple artifact or optical illusion. This was real, too real, but as soon as the image had appeared, it vanished. The screen flickered, and in an instant the figure was gone, replaced by a generic shot of the Martian landscape. I tried to go back, to retrieve the image, but it wasn't in the history. It was as if it had never existed. I had to recover that image. I had to know what that figure was. Without thinking twice, I started searching through the archives, accessing databases I normally didn't have permission for. I was determined to find that image, to understand what I had seen. I spent hours trying to recover the file, using every trick I knew to access the deepest records. But no matter how hard I tried, the image remained unreachable. It was as if someone had completely erased its existence. And the more I tried, the more convinced I became that there was something or someone who didn't want me to see it. That's when I felt it, a presence behind me, watching me. I turned around quickly, and there he was, my supervisor, standing in the doorway of my office with a cold, calculating expression on his face. There was something in his eyes that made me feel as if I had been caught doing something forbidden, something dangerous. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of the machines. My heart was pounding, expecting a reprimand, a rebuke, maybe even dismissal for having tried to access restricted areas, but what came next was even more disconcerting. "Well, so you figured it out," he said with an unsettling calmness, a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. I didn't know how to respond. My mind was trying to find an excuse, an explanation that would sound credible. But before I could open my mouth, he raised a hand, indicating me not to say anything. "Come with me," he said, turning on his heels and walking towards his office. "We have a lot to talk about." My legs felt like lead as I followed him. Each step echoed in the empty hallways. Each meter I walked made me feel like I was entering a terrain from which I couldn't return. He closed the door behind me with a click that sounded too definitive and indicated that I should take a seat. I observed his face as he settled into his chair and noticed a weariness in his eyes that I hadn't perceived before. It was as if he carried the weight of years of silence, of secrets too dark to share. But now, for some reason I still didn't understand, he was about to break that silence. "What I'm going to tell you," he began in a grave voice, "isn't in the books or the archives. It's the kind of truth that isn't documented, because if it were, it could destroy everything we know." I felt a chill run down my spine. I nodded without saying anything, waiting for him to continue. "The discovery you saw," he said, leaning forward, "wasn't an accident. In fact, it wasn't a discovery at all. What you caught in that image is something we've known about for a long time, something that has been carefully hidden from everyone, even from most of those who work here." I looked at him intently, trying to process what he was saying. I knew there was something on Mars, but I never imagined it would be so big, so dangerous. "Let me tell you a story," he continued. "Many years ago, before I joined NASA, I served in the Air Force. I was young, idealistic, and believed in the values of my country. It was in 1958, at the height of the Cold War. One night we received an urgent call, a mission in the Nevada desert. We weren't given details, just instructions to secure an area where something had crashed." He paused, as if the words were difficult to pronounce. "When we arrived, what we found wasn't of this world. It was a ship, but not like ours. It was something organic, as if it had grown instead of being built. Among the debris, there were 3 bodies, 2 were dead, but 1 was still breathing. His voice trembled slightly as he remembered that moment. That being wasn't human. Its skin was reddish, hard like metal but flexible. It had an exoskeleton that made it look like a creature out of a nightmare. We moved it to a secret base where scientists tried to communicate with it. For weeks, they tried to understand its language, its signs, until finally they achieved a rudimentary exchange of ideas. That's when the Martian made its offer. My hands began to sweat as I listened, unable to look away from his face. "It offered us technology," he continued, "things we didn't even know could exist at that time. Wireless communications, new energy sources, everything in exchange for human lives." I felt my heart stop for a moment. "Human lives," I repeated, barely in a whisper. The supervisor nodded slowly with a sadness in his eyes that made me understand how deep the remorse he carried was. "They saw us as cattle, as resources, and our superiors, desperate to gain an advantage over the Soviets, accepted the deal. In exchange for technology that would change the course of history, they handed over humans to these beings, knowing they would be used for purposes we couldn't even imagine." For a moment, silence filled the room, so heavy that I could barely breathe. "Since then," he said finally, "we've kept that agreement secret. The technological advances you've seen in recent decades didn't come from the human mind. They were gifts from those beings, paid for with human lives. And the most terrifying thing of all is that we never know how many more we'll have to sacrifice before they decide we're no longer useful." I wanted to say something, but the words choked in my throat. Everything I thought I knew, everything I had defended as the pinnacle of human ingenuity, was crumbling before me. "The discovery you saw," my supervisor continued, "is just the tip of the iceberg. Mars isn't the desolate planet they've made us believe. It's their home, a refuge beneath the surface where they've continued to develop, away from our gaze. And what you saw, that figure, is proof that they're much more advanced than we could imagine." The words of my supervisor echoed in my mind like an endless echo. Even when I retired to my office, I couldn't stop thinking about what he had revealed to me. In the hours and days that followed, I tried to resume my usual routine, but everything had changed. The data I used to review with an analytical and detached mind now seemed full of secrets and lies. Each transmission, each reading, each image from Mars made me wonder how many lives had been sacrificed to obtain them. The impact of the discovery was so profound that I could barely concentrate. My colleagues noticed my state, but I avoided their questions with vague and evasive answers. I couldn't share what I knew. The risk was too great. My supervisor, perhaps understanding my need to know more, gave me access to a set of classified files that until then had been out of my reach. It was a kind of tacit permission, a door that he himself had decided to open for me. I knew that what I was going to find there wouldn't bring me peace, but curiosity, or perhaps desperation, pushed me to continue. The files were vast, a labyrinth of documents, images, and recordings that detailed decades of secret collaboration between Earth governments and the inhabitants of Mars. Each file I opened plunged me deeper into an abyss of horror. The first file I found was an old black-and-white recording that showed the first attempts at communication with the being captured in Nevada in 1958. The scientists spoke in whispers, as if they feared being heard, while they tried to decipher a language that didn't belong to this world. The being, with its metallic skin and exoskeleton, emitted sounds that didn't resemble anything I had heard before, but the most disturbing thing was when they finally managed to understand its proposal: technology in exchange for human lives. Each file I reviewed took me further into that horror story. The most recent recordings I reviewed were a panoramic view of what they called human farms. The term itself was disturbing enough, But what the screen showed was much worse. In a vast underground cavern, illuminated by a dim, reddish light that didn't seem to come from any natural source, endless rows of metal cages extended. Inside them, naked and chained human bodies lay in uncomfortable positions, with no space to move, no privacy, no hope. The cages were like cells stacked one on top of another, and in each of them, men, women and children, all with empty gazes, seemed to have given up any hint of resistance. Their bodies were bruised, marked by scars, their skin clinging to their bones from malnutrition. There were no screams, only an unsettling silence occasionally broken by the muffled groans of those who hadn't completely resigned themselves to their fate. The Martians, those beings with exoskeletons that gave them the appearance of giant insects, moved between the cages with an unsettling calmness. They observed the prisoners as a farmer inspects his cattle, without the slightest trace of emotion or compassion. From time to time, one of them would point to a human, and other Martians would come to open the cage and take out the unfortunate one, dragging them out of the camera's view. I continued watching, unable to look away, as the recording changed scenes. Now the camera showed what was happening outside the cages. The selected humans were taken to a kind of platform where they were tied up and exposed before a crowd of Martians who observed them with a mixture of curiosity and coldness. Then, with terrifying precision, the Martians began the process of sacrifice. The breeding method was equally horrifying. Women were forced to reproduce paired with selected men, also by force. There was no compassion, no sense of humanity in the process. It was industrial reproduction designed to maximize the production of new prisoners. Children born on these farms were snatched from their mothers at birth, raised in special cages until they reached the age to be sacrificed or used in experiments. The experiments, those were the worst. In another recording, I observed a group of Martians surrounding a human tied to a metal table. They inserted long, sharp needles into his skull, extracting fluids while the prisoner screamed in agony. Others were subjected to a kind of vivisection, with their organs removed one by one, while the Martians took notes as if they were studying the human body's responses to extreme pain. There was no scientific purpose in these experiments that could justify such brutality. There were no medical discoveries that could be expected from these torture sessions. They were acts of sadism, as if the Martians found pleasure in the suffering of their victims. Their faces, if they could be called that, showed no emotion, but their actions spoke of a kind of morbid curiosity, a need to unravel every secret of the human body, regardless of the cost. My stomach churned as I watched the scenes of carnage. I felt short of breath, as if the walls of the room were closing in on me. Each scream, each wet sound of torn flesh pierced me like a sharp blade. It was endless suffering, a cycle of death and pain that seemed to have no end. I don't know how long I spent watching those recordings, losing my sense of time and place. I only know that when I finally pulled away from the screen, I was no longer the same. I had seen too much. I knew too much. The truth, that terrible truth that I had pursued with such insistence, was now a burden I couldn't bear. The decline of my supervisor began subtly, so discreet that at first I thought he was simply tired. After years of secrets and the burden of what he had revealed, it couldn't be easy to bear. However, as the weeks passed, his condition worsened alarmingly. Every time I saw him, he seemed more fragile. His skin became pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, once full of cold determination, were now sunken and dull. What had initially been a slight cough turned into a constant wheeze, and his figure, which had once been robust, began to hunch under the weight of an illness that seemed to be consuming him from within. Despite his deteriorating health, work at NASA continued as if nothing had happened, as if his absence was simply a minor change in the gears of a machine that never stops. Missions to Mars continued with new announcements and discoveries that captured the public's imagination and fed the official narrative of space exploration. However, now I saw everything with different eyes. Each new launch, each announcement about a scientific breakthrough, seemed to me a smokescreen designed to divert attention from what was really happening. I knew that Mars wasn't the dead desert they said it was, and every time I saw a transmission of these supposed missions, I felt that the entire world was being deceived. The press releases followed one after another, each more grandiose than the last. They talked about new drilling technologies to study the Martian subsoil, rock samples that could contain traces of ancient life, plans to send humans to the Red Planet in the not-too-distant future. And while the world celebrated, I saw all of that for what it really was: carefully orchestrated distractions to keep humanity looking in the wrong direction. I knew too much, and that knowledge began to weigh on me more than I could bear. I'm doing this because I can't live with this burden, but I know that as soon as this becomes public, my life will be in danger. By the time you see this video, I may have already disappeared, like so many others before me. But if that happens, I want you to know that it wasn't an accident, it wasn't a coincidence. If I disappear, it's because someone somewhere decided that I knew too much. I want you to know that it's not safe to walk alone in certain places. The Martians aren't content with just hunting on Mars. They've been operating on our planet for years, taking advantage of the darkness, the isolated forests, the abandoned roads. If you ever feel like someone is following you at night, if you hear strange noises in the woods or see lights where there shouldn't be any, get away. These aren't accidents. They aren't simple disappearances. They're hunts. The warning has been given. Whether to believe it or not is up to you. I wish you luck. Goodbye, and stay safe. For weeks after my conversation with my supervisor, I lived in a state of constant anxiety. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every unexpected sound made me jump. I couldn't sleep, plagued by nightmares of metal cages and alien experiments. The weight of the knowledge I now carried was crushing me, changing me in ways I couldn't have imagined. At work, I tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, but I knew I was failing. My colleagues gave me concerned looks, and I overheard whispers about my changed behavior. I wanted to scream at them, to shake them and make them understand the horror that was happening right under our noses. But I knew I couldn't. The consequences would be too severe, not just for me, but for anyone I told. One day, about a month after my supervisor's revelation, I arrived at work to find his office empty. His personal effects were gone, and there was no sign that he had ever occupied the space. When I asked about him, I was met with blank stares and non-committal answers. It was as if he had never existed. I knew then that I was on my own. Whatever protection my supervisor's position had afforded me was gone. I was now the sole keeper of a truth too terrible to bear alone, but too dangerous to share. In the days that followed, I noticed subtle changes in the office. New faces appeared in key positions, people I had never seen before, but who seemed to command respect and fear from long-time employees. Security measures were tightened, and there was a palpable tension in the air. I tried to continue my work as before, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. Every piece of data I analyzed, every image I reviewed, now seemed tainted by the knowledge of what was really happening on Mars. I found myself second-guessing everything, looking for hidden messages or clues in the most mundane transmissions. One evening, as I was working late, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. It was a series of coordinates buried deep within a routine data transmission from one of the Mars rovers. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a string of numbers, but as I cross-referenced it with our maps of the Martian surface, I realized it pointed to a location we had never officially explored. With shaking hands, I pulled up the satellite imagery of the area. What I saw defied explanation. There, in the middle of what should have been barren Martian desert, was a structure. It was massive, easily the size of a small city, and it was clearly not natural. The geometry was too perfect, the lines too straight. This was something built by intelligent beings. I quickly downloaded the images to a secure drive, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I had just stumbled upon something I was never meant to see. As I was about to log out of the system, a message popped up on my screen. "We see you. Stop now." Panic gripped me. They knew. Somehow they knew what I had found. I grabbed the drive and ran, not even bothering to shut down my computer. As I raced through the corridors, I could hear footsteps behind me, getting closer with each passing second. I managed to make it to my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I peeled out of the parking lot, I saw figures emerging from the building, their inhuman silhouettes illuminated by the streetlights. For hours I drove aimlessly, constantly checking my rear-view mirror for signs of pursuit. My mind was racing, trying to process what I had seen and figure out what to do next. I knew I couldn't go home. That would be the first place they'd look. I needed a plan. As dawn broke, I found myself in a small town I didn't recognize. I parked behind a dilapidated motel and tried to gather my thoughts. I had evidence now, real, tangible proof of the Martian presence and the conspiracy to hide it. But what could I do with it? Who could I trust? I spent the next few days moving from town to town, never staying in one place for more than a night. I used cash only, avoided cameras, and tried to blend in as much as possible. All the while I was working on a plan to get the truth out. I couldn't go to the media. They were too easily controlled, too easily silenced. The government was out of the question for obvious reasons. I needed a way to reach people directly, to bypass the traditional channels of information. That's when I decided to create this video. I knew it was risky, that it might cost me my life, but I couldn't stay silent any longer. The world needed to know the truth, no matter the consequences. As I sit here now, recording this message, I can't help but wonder if it's already too late. Have the Martians already infiltrated our society to such an extent that we're beyond saving? Are we nothing more than cattle to them, a resource to be exploited until we're no longer useful? But I have to believe that there's still hope. That if enough people learn the truth, we can fight back. We can reclaim our planet and our future. To those of you watching this, I implore you, don't dismiss this as the ravings of a madman. Look around you. Question everything. The signs are there if you know where to look. Remember the unexplained disappearances that have been increasing over the years. The leaps in technology that seem to defy our understanding of physics. The strange lights in the sky that are quickly explained away or forgotten. It's all connected. And to those who might be thinking of coming forward, of revealing what they know, be careful. The forces aligned against us are powerful and ruthless. They will stop at nothing to keep their secret. But we can't let fear silence us. The future of humanity depends on the truth coming to light. As I prepare to release this video, I know that my days are numbered. By the time you see this, I may already be gone, captured, killed, or worse. But if my sacrifice means that others will wake up to the truth, then it will have been worth it. I've hidden copies of all the evidence I've gathered in secure locations around the country. If anything happens to me, that information will be automatically released. It's my insurance policy, my way of ensuring that the truth will come out, one way or another. To my family, if you're watching this, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the pain and uncertainty I've put you through. Know that everything I've done to protect you and to secure a future for all of us. To my colleagues at NASA, Those who are genuinely in the dark about what's happening, I don't blame you. The deception runs deep, and it's designed to keep even those on the inside from seeing the full picture. But now that you know, you have a choice to make. Will you continue to be part of the lie, or will you stand up for the truth? And to the Martians, if you're monitoring this, know that we won't go quietly. Humanity has faced existential threats before, and we've always found a way to survive, to adapt, to overcome. You may have technology beyond our understanding, but we have something you seem to lack: compassion, empathy, and an indomitable spirit. As I conclude this message, I'm acutely aware that these may be my final words to the world. The weight of what I'm about to do is almost unbearable, but I know it's necessary. The truth must be told, no matter the cost. To those who will carry on this fight after I'm gone, stay strong, stay vigilant, and most importantly, stay human. Our humanity, our capacity for love, for hope, for resilience, that's what sets us apart. That's what will save us in the end. The road ahead will be difficult. There will be those who refuse to believe, those who will actively work against us. But every great change in history has started with a small group of people willing to stand up for what's right. As I prepare to upload this video, I can hear strange noises outside. They've found me. I don't have much time left. Remember, the truth is out there. It's up to you now to find it, to spread it, to act on it. This is not goodbye. This is a call to action. The future of our species hangs in the balance. What happens next is up to you. Stay safe, stay strong, and never stop fighting for the truth. The video ends abruptly with the sound of a door being forcibly opened and inhuman screeching in the background. In the days following the release of the video, chaos erupted. Social media platforms were flooded with copies of the recording, each one taken down almost as quickly as it was uploaded. Mainstream news outlets initially dismissed it as an elaborate hoax, a piece of viral marketing for an upcoming sci-fi film. But as more people watched the video, questions began to arise. Internet sleuths started digging into the background of the man in the video, cross-referencing his claims with publicly available information. To everyone's surprise, much of what he said checked out. The NASA employee he claimed to be did exist and had indeed disappeared without explanation just weeks before the video surfaced. Governments around the world scrambled to contain the situation. Official statements were released, denouncing the video as fake news and urging citizens to remain calm. But the cat was out of the bag. The seed of doubt had been planted in the minds of millions. Conspiracy theorists, long dismissed as crackpots, suddenly found themselves thrust into the spotlight. Their past claims about alien presence on Earth were re-examined with new eyes. Some of their predictions, once thought outlandish, now seemed eerily prescient. As public pressure mounted, cracks began to appear in the official narrative. A low-level NASA employee, inspired by the video, came forward with corroborating evidence. She provided internal documents that hinted at a massive cover-up, though she claimed not to have known the full extent of it until seeing the viral video. The scientific community was thrown into turmoil. Many dismissed the claims outright, citing the lack of peer-reviewed evidence. But others began to re-examine past data with a new perspective. Anomalies in Mars rover transmissions, previously attributed to equipment malfunction or natural phenomena, were scrutinized with renewed interest. Meanwhile, reports of strange sightings and unexplained disappearances skyrocketed. Whether this was due to increased awareness or an actual uptick in activity was unclear. But the fear was real. People began to look at their neighbors with suspicion, wondering if the person next door was really who they claimed to be. Governments worldwide tightened security measures, ostensibly to protect citizens from mass hysteria. But many saw these actions as attempts to control the flow of information and suppress further leaks. As weeks turned into months, society found itself at a crossroads. The world was divided between those who believed in the Martian presence and those who dismissed it as an elaborate hoax. Families were torn apart, friendships strained, as people grappled with the implications of this potential reality. In academic circles, a new field of study emerged, focusing on the possibility of advanced alien civilizations and their potential impact on human history. Archaeological sites around the world were re-examined, looking for evidence of extraterrestrial influence that might have been overlooked or misinterpreted. The space programs of various nations came under intense scrutiny. Calls for transparency and civilian oversight grew louder by the day. Some countries responded by declassifying old documents related to space exploration, though critics argued that these releases were carefully curated to exclude any damning evidence. In the political arena, a new movement gained traction. Calling themselves the Truth Seekers, they advocated for full disclosure of all government knowledge related to extraterrestrial life. They organized protests, lobbied politicians, and used social media to spread their message. As the movement grew, so did the pushback against it. Skeptics argued that the whole situation was a mass delusion, a result of societal fears, and the human tendency to see patterns where none exist. They pointed out the lack of concrete, verifiable evidence and warned against the dangers of baseless paranoia. The man from the video, the whistleblower who had started it all, was never found. Some claimed he had been silenced by the government, others that he had been taken by the Martians. A few even suggested that he had never existed at all, that the whole video was an elaborate deepfake designed to destabilize society. As the years passed, the initial furor died down, but the questions remained. The world had changed irrevocably. People looked at the night sky differently now, with a mixture of wonder and fear. The idea that we might not be alone in the universe, that we might in fact be at the mercy of a far superior civilization, had taken root in the collective consciousness of humanity. Whether this new awareness would lead to our salvation or our downfall remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: the comfortable illusion of human supremacy in the cosmos had been shattered. We were faced with the possibility that we were not the masters of our own destiny, that our future might be determined by forces beyond our comprehension or control. As I sit here now, years after first encountering that fateful video, I can't help but wonder about the man who risked everything to bring this truth to light. Was he a hero, a madman, or something in between? And more importantly, was he right? Are we really living side by side with an alien race, oblivious to their true nature and intentions? I don't have the answers. Nobody does, not with certainty. But I do know that his actions, whether based on truth or delusion, have forever changed the way we view our place in the universe. And perhaps that, in itself, is a kind of victory. The search for truth continues, the vigilance remains, and humanity, resilient as ever, adapts to this new reality, a reality where the line between terrestrial and extraterrestrial, between fact and fiction, has become irrevocably blurred. As I look up at the night sky, at the red dot that is Mars, I can't help but feel a chill run down my spine. Are they watching us even now, planning their next move? Or are we alone in our fears, conjuring monsters from the depths of our imagination? Only time will tell. But one thing is certain: we can never go back to the blissful ignorance of before. The question of our place in the cosmos, of our potential vulnerability to forces beyond our world, will forever be part of our collective consciousness. And so, we move forward into an uncertain future, forever changed by one man's desperate act of truth-telling. Whether that change will lead to our salvation or our doom remains to be seen. But we face it together, as a species united by a shared mystery and a common quest for understanding. The truth is out there, and we will never stop searching for it.
And this was a report. Before we go to the next one, leave your opinion in the comments. We would love to know. Now let's move on to the next one.
I'm sure you've heard of Apollo 1. You know it as a tragic accident, a dark chapter in the history of space exploration. But that's just a lie, a story fabricated to keep the world in the dark. What really happened on that mission was never meant for the public eye. That day could have changed the course of humanity, a day when the truth could have been revealed, if not for those wretched souls who decided to bury it alongside the bodies of my comrades. 1967 should have been the year the world learned the truth, but instead NASA chose to cover it all up. And I've lived with that burden ever since. My name is Colin Pierce, and for as long as I can remember, outer space has been my greatest fascination. I always wanted to know what lay beyond the skies, past the constellations, and just how far the universe might stretch. When I was barely 11, I would immerse myself in magazines about spacecraft, completely captivated by the idea of exploring the unknown. As the time for college drew near, I knew I had to choose a career that would bring me closer to the stars. I asked my father for help in pursuing aerospace or mechanical engineering, maybe even electrical, anything that would let me work near spacecraft and learn more about this fascinating world. So, at the age of 20, around 1954 or 55, I can't remember exactly, I decided to go with aerospace engineering. As my studies progressed, I heard about the creation of the now famous National Aeronautics and Space Administration in '58. My excitement grew even more, and the thrill of being part of something so monumental pushed me to give it my all. Finally, at the age of 30, having graduated as an aeronautical engineer, I joined NASA's team in December of 1965. I had achieved my dream. I was content and fulfilled. But little did I know that reaching that point would become the worst thing that ever happened to me. January 25th, 1967 started like any other day at NASA. I was in my office, deeply engrossed in the plans for a shuttle that Charles Kevin Jackson, a fellow engineer, had brought me that morning. It was impressive, an innovative design I hadn't seen before. I was so absorbed in the details that I barely noticed when NASA's spokesperson entered the room. "Pierce, we need to talk," he said in a tone that snapped me out of my thoughts. He dropped a document on my desk, one with 3 names, Virgil G. Grissom, Edward H. White, and Roger B. Chaffee. They were the selected crew members for a special mission. He explained that they needed one more person on the team, someone well-versed in spacecraft parts, especially in handling emergency repairs. As I read those names and understood the magnitude of what he was saying, my eyes filled with tears of emotion. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I was about to become part of something historic. I shouted with joy, feeling a mix of pride and wonder. This was the moment I had worked for all my life. I knew I was about to leave my indelible mark on American history. "The spacecraft launches on January 27th, the spokesperson added. In the distance, I saw an older man approaching, who I later realized was NASA's administrator. I watched him walk up to the spokesperson, and I overheard him saying that the mission was too risky to allow a civilian to join, that it was dangerous. However, I clearly saw how the administrator gestured for him to be quiet and hold his tongue. I didn't pay too much attention to what I saw. My excitement had taken over. There were only 2 days left. I could barely process the news. I dropped everything I was doing and rushed home to tell my wife. Her reaction was different from mine. She was worried, anxious. She said she didn't agree with it, that going into space was too dangerous, that it exposed us to the unknown. I tried to reassure her, but deep down I knew her fears were valid. Still, I was determined. That night I cried tears of joy, while she cried tears of sadness for the uncertain fate that awaited me. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept tossing and turning in bed, thinking about the mission ahead. Before I knew it, the sun was already high in the sky. I jumped out of bed, got dressed quickly, and headed to work. That day, I treated all my colleagues to breakfast. I wanted to share my joy with them. We laughed and joked, enjoying the morning like never before. When I got home later, exhaustion overcame me. I fell asleep without realizing it, and when I woke up, I knew the day had arrived, January 27th, 1967. I jumped out of bed, dressed hurriedly, and ran to NASA. When I arrived, I headed to the area where the final preparations were being made. Upon entering, the NASA administrator greeted me with a calm smile. "Relax, Pierce," he said. "The launch is at 6 p.m. today." I nodded, took a deep breath, and went to my office to kill time. The wait was endless. At 3 p.m. they called me to give the final instructions and show me the equipment we would use. They explained how to put on the suit, how the oxygen tanks worked. The more I learned, the more my excitement grew. At 5 p.m. I went to the place where the suits were. There I met Virgil Gus Grissom, the commander and crew leader. He was an educated, handsome and eloquent man. He greeted me with a kindness that made me feel welcome. Standing beside him was Edward H. White, the command module pilot. White was serious, almost distant. He gave me a brief greeting, and I could see in his eyes that he was nervous, though he tried to hide it. Finally, Roger B. Chaffee, the lunar module pilot, arrived. He was tall, with a calm expression that inspired confidence. He asked me how I was feeling, to which I replied that I was fine. He nodded slightly and we all got ready, putting on our suits and oxygen tanks. Once equipped, we were directed to the cabin of Apollo 1. We were ready for launch. I sat next to Roger Chaffee, who, during the wait, explained how the lunar module worked, how to start it, and how to operate it. At first, I didn't understand why he was giving me such detailed instructions, and honestly, I wasn't that interested. I was more excited about getting to the moon. Finally, the moment arrived. At 6 p.m., Apollo 1 launched, propelled by an immense force that shook me to the core. As we ascended, I clung tightly to my seat, amazed by the power of the booster. The spacecraft vibrated and trembled, but everything was working perfectly. Virgil Gus Grissom led with unshakable calm, and Roger maneuvered with impressive professionalism. The sight of Earth shrinking behind us was overwhelming, but I couldn't shake a growing unease. Something about the silence of space felt different, more oppressive than I had imagined. I remember thinking this was normal, since it was my first time experiencing the vastness of space. I felt a chill, not from the cold, but from the excitement of being out there, in outer space, looking out into the universe. It was incredible, a vastness I couldn't believe I was seeing with my own eyes. As a child, I had only imagined what I was now witnessing, but there I was, floating in the immense darkness of space. I couldn't contain myself. I talked non-stop, describing every detail I saw. It was as if I needed to express everything I was feeling in that moment. But Commander Grissom, with his usual calm, asked me to keep quiet. "Pierce, we're going to be here a while. I need some peace," he said, and I got the message. The journey was long, over 25 hours traveling through outer space. But then, something broke the calm. The commander announced that he had detected a structural fault in the spacecraft. My heart skipped a beat when he mentioned the possibility that we had collided with something. I looked out one of the side windows and saw it, a crack in the hull of the ship. From the base at NASA, they immediately alerted us. We had to seal that hole as quickly as possible, or we would lose oxygen fast. The commander looked straight at me, and I knew what was coming. "Pierce, you're the one for this mission. This is your job," he said without hesitation. My mind filled with nerves, but I knew this was what I had been trained to do. The 3 astronauts helped me get ready to go outside and fix the breach. With the equipment on, I stepped out of the ship, feeling the pressure of the vacuum around me. The crack was near the capsule, which made the task a little easier, but when I got closer to inspect it, something deeply unsettled me. That crack didn't look like it had been caused by a simple impact. It was perfectly shaped, circular, as if something had deliberately attacked us. I was stunned. I had never seen such a flawless hole in any simulation or exercise. Quickly, I used a special adhesive that dried even in the absence of air and sealed the crack as best as I could. However, what I had seen out there left me uneasy. I didn't mention anything to the astronauts. I didn't want to alarm them with what I had seen. Not yet. So, after securing the repair, I re-entered the ship, and we continued. It had been 48 hours since our launch, and honestly, I was no longer thrilled about being in space. I felt an increasing desire to return to Earth, especially after what I had seen outside. Something felt off. I couldn't stop thinking about what could have caused such a perfect crack. I was scared, a fear I couldn't shake. Then, the capsule began to vibrate violently, the lights flickered, and the instruments went haywire. The commander kept repeating for us to stay calm, trying to maintain control. From NASA's base, they informed us that we had entered an unexpected gravitational field that was affecting our ship, making it veer almost as if it were alive. The chaos lasted for what felt like hours, but eventually the vibration stopped. After nearly 70 hours of travel, the moon appeared before us. It was majestic, with its immense and awe-inspiring craters. Despite everything bad we had endured during the journey, seeing the moon so close made it all worthwhile, though deep down, the unease continued to grow within me. The sight of the moon gave us a brief sense of relief, but my mind couldn't stop racing about what had happened. What was that crack we had found in space? I didn't say anything. I kept my fears in check, but something told me the worst was yet to come. We prepared for landing on the far side of the moon. I couldn't take my eyes off the massive craters that gaped like hungry mouths beneath us. Finally, we stabilized and began our descent. As we did, I felt a strange tension in the air, as if the moon itself was waiting for our arrival. The landing was smoother than I expected, but that didn't ease the tension that had gripped my body. We touched down on the far side of the moon, a place no previous mission had ever explored. The view was desolate, with a grey landscape stretching as far as the eye could see. But there was something more, something I couldn't quite identify, a feeling that we were not alone. Commander Grissom was the first to speak after the spacecraft had stabilized. "We're here. Let's get started with the procedures, boys," he said firmly. Although it wasn't necessary for me to leave the spacecraft, I insisted on joining the others. It was my responsibility, I told myself. Roger stayed in lunar orbit while the 3 of us prepared to exit. After ensuring everything was in order, we began getting ready for our lunar walk. The first inspection of the terrain went smoothly. We collected samples of lunar soil, took the necessary measurements, but something continued to gnaw at the back of my mind. Then we saw it in the distance, a structure. It didn't resemble anything we had ever seen before. It was partially buried in the lunar surface, and its shape was far from natural. It looked like a construction, but not one made by human hands. Gus was the first to decide we needed to investigate. It wasn't part of the mission, but we knew this was important, something that could change everything. We approached cautiously. The closer we got, the clearer it became that this structure didn't belong to anything we recognized. The building was massive, about 30 feet tall and 60 feet wide, imposing and terrifying in its presence. As we explored, I moved closer. That's when I saw it. Stuck into the lunar soil, waving gently, there was a flag. My eyes couldn't believe what they were seeing. I approached, and as I got a closer look, my heart stopped. For an instant, the flag appeared red, with a sickle and hammer emblazoned in gold in the upper left corner, along with a red star bordered in gold. I recognized it instantly, the flag of the Soviet Union. This has to be a joke, I thought, but it wasn't. I stepped even closer, and what I saw next chilled me to my core. Written on the flag was a date, July 4th, 1965. That date seared into my mind like a branding iron. We weren't the first to set foot on the moon. Disappointment mixed with a growing sense of danger. As I touched the flag, a dull hum filled the air. It wasn't a normal sound, at least not one we're used to. I turned around slowly, and what I saw paralyzed me with fear. A tall, menacing creature was attacking one of the astronauts. My eyes adjusted to the lunar darkness, and I saw it was Commander Grissom under attack. Ed White, just a few feet away, was desperately trying to leap back toward the service module. His movements were frantic. He motioned for me to flee, to follow him. Without thinking twice, I began bounding desperately toward the module, but I didn't make it far. Another creature appeared in front of me. This one was smaller than the first, but no less terrifying. It stood about 6 feet tall, thin, with an insect-like appearance. It had wings that spanned about 6 feet, and its large dark eyes fixed on me with an intelligent malice. It moved with an impossible swiftness in the low lunar gravity, as if it owned the place. I didn't understand why it could move like that at the time, but years later, I realized it was due to the difference in gravity between Earth and the Moon. One of these beings grabbed Commander Grissom, and with terrifying ease, it ripped off his helmet. I watched in horror as Gus's face darkened rapidly before his head exploded in a cloud of blood and tissue. The creature began to collect his corpse, dragging it toward the structure we had discovered. There was nothing I could do for the commander, so I turned and ran toward Ed. We tried to make it to the module together, but we were intercepted by another creature. This time, the being spat a corrosive liquid that partially burned through Ed's suit. A type of tentacle extended from the lower part of the creature, trapping Ed and dragging him into the darkness. I ran with all my might. Fear was driving me. I managed to climb into the service module, and Roger B. Chaffee, his face pale, helped me into the command module. He was shaken. My words tumbled out as I tried to tell him we had to go back for them, that we couldn't leave them there. "We can't do that, Colin. There's no way to save them," Roger said with a coldness that shocked me. A faint buzzing, almost like a screech, echoed through the ship, accompanied by a vibration that nearly knocked me off balance. Outside, one of the creatures was tearing apart the spacecraft. Roger cursed under his breath, then looked at me with determination. "Sit down," he ordered. "Remember how it was operated. You're going to do it. You're going to make it back." Before I could respond, Roger left the module. I watched him leap toward the creature, throwing himself at it with everything he had. I saw him disappear into the shadows as the creature reached him. With tears in my eyes and a broken heart, I forced myself to follow Roger's instructions. I couldn't let his sacrifice be in vain. Crying for the loss of these brave men, I managed to get the module moving in the direction of Earth. As I passed through the void of space, only one thought haunted me. Aliens exist. I knew what I had witnessed would change the world forever, but I also knew convincing anyone of the truth wouldn't be easy. The command module moved slowly, drifting away from the lunar surface. Outside, the vast darkness of space stretched infinitely, but I could barely focus on that. My mind was flooded with images of what I had left behind: Gus, Ed, and Roger, all dead. I couldn't shake the scene of their deaths from my mind, especially the commander's, his head exploding under the pressure of that murderous vacuum. Roger's words echoed in my head as I tried to keep control of the module. "You have to do it. You're going to make it back." I had never operated the module by myself, at least not under these circumstances. Every move felt clumsy, every decision a gamble, but I knew I had to do it, not just for me, but for them, so their deaths wouldn't be in vain. As I continued toward Earth, the systems began failing intermittently. The lights flickered and the gauges gave erratic readings. I tried to stabilize the ship, but everything seemed to be falling apart around me. The creatures that had destroyed the spacecraft still loomed large in my mind, but I couldn't afford to succumb to fear. The gravity of the situation hit me with full force. I was alone in a damaged ship, surrounded by the void of space. The possibility of not making it, of dying out there, became more and more real, but I clung to the hope that somehow I would make it back to Earth. The journey was hell. I spent nearly 75 hours in that spacecraft, but I finally made it back to Earth. When I noticed I was entering Earth's orbit, my mind went blank. When I finally regained consciousness, the first thing I saw was the warm, white light illuminating the room. My body ached, every muscle heavy as lead, but what truly took my breath away was the sight of several armed military guards stationed around my bed. They seemed to be waiting for something, and that something was me. I tried to speak, but my voice was barely a whisper. The memories of what I had lived through flooded back, and the weight of reality settled on my chest. The images of those terrifying beings, the deaths of Gus, Ed, and Roger. Everything came back to me in an uncontrollable torrent. I couldn't help it. Tears began to stream down my face. The head of NASA, who I recognized immediately, was there, patiently waiting for me to wake up. When he saw me crying, he approached with an expression I couldn't read. "What's wrong with you?" he asked. His tone was a mix of curiosity and concern. I couldn't speak. I could barely breathe. But he pressed on. Then he ordered the guards to leave the room. Once we were alone, he looked directly into my eyes and told me to continue. With a trembling voice, broken by grief, I told him everything, every detail, every horror we had faced on the moon. I told him about the extraterrestrial beings that had attacked us, how they killed my comrades in the most brutal way imaginable. I told him about the desperate struggle to return to Earth. I left nothing out, except the flag. That I decided to keep to myself. It was a secret I wasn't ready to share. Not yet. The head of NASA listened in silence, without interrupting. When I finished, he remained quiet for a moment. Then, to my surprise, he let out a small laugh. "So it was true then," he said, almost as if he were talking to himself. My stomach churned. I looked at him in horror, beginning to realize what had happened. Before I could speak, he continued, "We sent a previous crew, but no one came back. We assumed they had all died." My world collapsed in that moment. I wanted to leap out of bed and punch him, kill him for what he had done. We had been sent to die, and he had known all along. "It's incredible that you made it back," Pierce added, his voice almost admiring. "We didn't expect anyone to survive." I couldn't hold back anymore. I interrupted him, my voice cracking with anger and fear. "I'm going to tell the world what happened. Everyone has to know." But his reaction was as calm as it was terrifying. He leaned in slightly and, in a near whisper, told me something that froze the blood in my veins. "You'd better not, Pierce. We know where your wife and family live." The terror I felt in that moment was worse than anything I had experienced on the moon. Suddenly I understood that I was trapped, that there was nothing I could do to change what had happened, what I had seen, what I had lived through. It would die with me. When I finally left the hospital, my mind was shattered. I went straight home, where my wife was waiting, her face full of worry. I didn't need to say anything. She understood immediately that we had to leave. We packed our things in silence, and that very night we moved to another state, far from everything, far from NASA, far from the nightmares I knew would never leave me. Days later, while flipping through a newspaper, I came across a headline that made my blood boil. In a tragic turn of events, the US space program suffered a significant blow today with the accident of Apollo 1, which occurred on the launch pad LC-34 at Kennedy Space Center. I read the article in disbelief, feeling the anger build in my chest. A fire had broken out inside the command module during a routine pre-launch test. The 3 astronauts on board, prepared for what was supposed to be a standard rehearsal, found themselves trapped in a desperate situation. It was a lie, a vile lie that hid the truth. They wanted the world to believe it was just an accident, that Gus, Ed, and Roger had died on Earth, not on the moon, facing horrors that no one should ever know about. I wanted to explode with rage, to scream the truth from the rooftops, but I knew there was nothing I could do about it. My family was at stake, and I couldn't risk it. Silence was my only option, a silence that ate me up inside, but one I knew I had to keep. Today, I'm an old man. I've lived in hiding for most of my life. But now, with death approaching, I'm no longer afraid. I've decided to tell the truth, to reveal what really happened. Although I know many won't believe me, this is my last chance to document what we lived through. So the world knows we are not alone, and we are not safe.
And this was a report. Before we go to the next one, leave your opinion in the comments. We would love to know. Now let's move on to the next one.
In all my years as a forensic pathologist in Berlin, I had received all kinds of bodies, some mutilated, others destroyed by accidents, bodies with mortal wounds, pulverized bones, and even decapitations. But none of those experiences prepared me for what I was about to discover when these strange bodies arrived at my office. I knew they concealed something terrifying, something that defied all imaginable logic. My name is Heinrich Müller. I'm 31 years old, and in 1971, I had already been working for 3 years in the office of the Chief Medical Examiner of Berlin, located in Mitte. I started there in 1968, a routine job that soon became my life. My work was simple. I documented each case that came into my hands in a folder, everything meticulously ordered, with precise dates and data on each event. During those years, I saw everything, from natural deaths to the most horrible tragedies, bodies that had suffered terrible accidents. But in 1971, nothing would prepare me for what I would see. Strange bodies started arriving, bodies that defied everything I had learned, everything I believed possible. These bodies were not normal. They defied all logic and understanding. They were something more, something I had never seen before in all my years in the morgue. And now, after so many years of silence, I will finally tell you what these bodies really were, what I discovered in them, and how they unveiled a secret so dark that it changed my life forever. These bodies were not of this world. I had started my night like any other. I remember that day very well. It was a Thursday in 1971. By then, I had been working in that morgue for about 3 years and a bit more, providing my services as an autopsy technician. Everything was so normal. The smell of formaldehyde permeated the air. That night, I arrived at the morgue at 6 in the evening, as usual. I wore my white coat, well adjusted. As every night while observing the wall clock, it was 10:37 at night, and the morgue was quieter than usual, something rare in a place like the Chief Medical Examiner's office in Berlin. Each body that entered, each autopsy I performed, was part of a routine that I had learned to master. I felt something different in the air, although I couldn't pinpoint what it was. Perhaps it was the way the silence seemed heavier than normal, or the way my thoughts resisted staying still. I was arranging my tools when I heard the echo of footsteps in the hallway. I looked up just in time to see the morgue door open. It was 2 men. One was a man of about 60 with a serious countenance, and the other was a young, dark-haired man. I think he was about 20 years old. They arrived at the morgue and introduced themselves as BND agents or something like that, and asked me if I had seen anything strange around there. I replied no, and specifically asked them what strange things could be. The older man looked at me fixedly and told me, without beating around the bush, that if I saw anything strange, I shouldn't hesitate to call the number on the card he then gave me. The card had a number. I kept it. I told them yes, that I would let them know, only I didn't know what things there could be. I thought they were referring to things like thefts or something. I didn't give it importance and threw the card in my toolbox. From there, I sat in my chair thinking about these men. I was a little disturbed and scared. I remember thinking that maybe there was a killer on the loose, so I tried to lock up, but there was no point. The next night, I was sitting in my office. No body had arrived yet. It was close to 10:50 at night when I heard a commotion outside. Without wasting time, I went out to see what it was about, although with fear, especially because of those men who had come the night before. As I went out, I encountered a tall man with graying hair and a severe expression who entered the room. He wore a long, dark coat, and there was something about his presence that put me on guard immediately. Behind him, 2 assistants pushed a gurney covered with a black body bag. This man raised his identification and then put it away. I didn't manage to see his name or badge as he quickly put it away. I began to suspect him, doubting that it was a real identity, especially because BND agents had come the night before. I thought this man could be the thief I imagined, but then he told me with slight authority, "Hey, keep quiet and follow me." Then he asked me if I had been visited by 2 men in suits. I replied yes, and he warned me that those men were not who they claimed to be. He didn't explain exactly who they were, but he insisted that if they came back, I should tell them I hadn't seen anything strange. I remembered that those men never showed me any identification, so I ended up believing this man more, who introduced himself as Frank Schmidt, a real BND agent. He added, telling me that he had a body he wanted me to examine. Something in his voice told me it wasn't a request. "What do we have here?" I asked, trying to sound professional while my mind started formulating questions I knew I shouldn't ask. "Something out of the ordinary," Frank replied, his words calculated. "I don't want this to be recorded in any official document. It shouldn't appear in your books, Heinrich. This case is confidential." I felt a chill run through me. I nodded, not because I fully understood, but because I felt I should. Frank gestured to the assistants to leave the gurney in the center of the room. When they left, he approached the body and lowered his voice. "Do the autopsy, but don't talk about this with anyone. When you're done, I want you to report to me and only to me. Understood?" Curiosity overcame my fear. I've handled strange cases before, but something in Frank's look made me feel this was different. I approached the gurney and pulled the zipper of the black bag. I saw that it was an apparently normal body, a man of about 70 years old lying on the gurney. He was dressed casually, with a shirt, common pants, and a black shoe. Everything seemed to be in place. I looked at the people and said, "I don't see anything strange about this man. I receive people like this every day. What's strange here?" You almost gave me a heart attack. Agent Frank looked at me so seriously that it scared me and said, "Just do the autopsy and then tell me what you find. I'm going to leave now and I'll be back tomorrow. Meanwhile, make sure to keep the body out of sight of the men in black suits." "Understood. No problem," I replied. The agent left and I approached the body. Without injecting formaldehyde, I began with a small incision in the lumbar area, and I swear to God I wish I hadn't made that cut. When making the incision, a nauseating gas emanated from the body, followed by a thick grey liquid that splashed my coat and the floor. I cursed while covering my face with my hands. The smell penetrated even through the mask I was wearing. I ran to the bathroom, took off my coat and hung it up. Then I washed my hands, took the cleaning products, and went back to clean the floor. When I returned to the bathroom, I noticed that the parts of the coat where the liquid had fallen were corroded, as if they had been in contact with acid. I went back to the body, this time with 2 masks instead of 1, and continued with the incision. It was a repulsive experience. I tried to prevent that disgusting liquid from touching my hands. After draining all the fluid, I managed to open the body, and what I saw was something I could never have imagined. When cutting the layers of skin instead of finding muscles, I discovered a greasy substance, similar to animal fat. Then I put my hand in to look for the organs, and instead of the kidneys, adrenal glands, and part of the large intestine, there were only some greenish tubes connected to each other. I remember saying over and over again, "What the hell are you?" Very amazed as I touched the different parts of that body, I found it hard to process what I was seeing. At first, I thought it was a joke, a fake body, but I quickly discarded that idea. Not knowing what to do, I started taking detailed notes and recording an audio describing everything I observed. At that moment, I thought about the possibility that it was something extraterrestrial, although I had never believed in those things. Still, I didn't know what else it could be. I decided to take some samples. I knew I was risking a lot, but I couldn't let all this disappear without a trace. While cutting small fragments of the tissue and storing them in vials, a part of me knew that I was crossing a dangerous line. However, the need to understand overcame the fear. While labeling the samples, I heard a metallic sound behind me. I turned quickly, my heart racing. The autopsy room door opened and Agent Frank Schmidt entered, his eyes fixed on the body. His expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his posture that I didn't like. "What have you found, Heinrich?" His voice was firm, but there was something in his tone that made me even more nervous. I took a breath, trying to sound professional. This is not normal, Frank. This body is not human, at least not entirely. The organs, the bone structure, everything is very wrong." Frank nodded slowly as if he already knew. He approached the body and observed it in silence for a few seconds before turning to me. "You already knew about this?" I asked. It was then that he revealed something surprising to me. This man was my neighbor. He moved to the neighborhood a few months ago. Since then, I noticed strange things, like intense lights that shone at night and woke me up almost always at the same time. In addition, this man received visits from those men dressed in black, always a few minutes after the lights appeared and disappeared. These events put me on alert, so I decided to investigate this subject. A few days ago, I found him lying in the yard of his house. I didn't hesitate and brought him here before the men in suits appeared. "You know what I think? I think this is an alien," he added. I turned pale. My suspicions were true. This man, or rather, this thing, was not from this planet. It took me half an hour to explain to Frank the details of the autopsy. His eyes were fixed on the creature as he said to me, "I want you to hide this body in a place where no one can find it. Do you understand? If they discover that we know something, we could be in danger." I remember thinking, why the cag was he making me part of this? I didn't want to get involved in this. All this was a ndi. I began to fear for my safety, but I couldn't do anything. I was already involved. I went to the most remote refrigeration chamber of the morgue. I stored it there. Before closing the body, I noticed a small hole in the temple that seemed to be from a bullet, slightly disguised with something that looked like makeup or something like that. I didn't give it much importance, as I felt a deep repulsion for that body. I put it in the refrigerator and left it there, relieved to have stored that thing. The next night I arrived at the morgue with a sense of dread. All day I couldn't stop thinking about the body that I had examined the night before fearful that those mysterious men would appear at any moment to claim it. I approached the body several times, looking over my shoulder, expecting to hear the footsteps of those guys, but nothing happened. The night progressed slowly, and just when I was about to fall asleep at my desk, they brought me another body. It was a young teenager. They placed him on the gurney, and I began to work on him. I was absorbed in my work when, half an hour later, I saw Frank Schmidt standing in the entrance of the morgue. What does this guy want now? I thought to myself. He gestured for me to let him in, and so I did. To my surprise, he brought another body with him. This time, it was an older woman, about 45 years old. At first glance, she weighed around 80 kilos. The assistants placed her on a gurney, and Frank began to speak. "Here's another body, Heinrich. I want you to examine it," Frank said, his voice loaded with authority. I had no choice but to do it. Frank told me he would be back in 30 minutes, so I quickly stored the body of the boy that had arrived first and began to work with the new body. The first thing I noticed was something on her neck, a mark that extended along it, as if she had been strangled with something. The mark was slightly camouflaged with women's makeup. I didn't think much about it and began with the incision. Given what I had seen in the previous body, I wanted to start cutting at the height of the navel, hoping that strange liquid would flow again, but I didn't notice anything. This time, the body seemed normal. As I examined the body, I noticed that everything was in place. The organs were fine. Everything seemed as it should. I remember thinking, what the hell is this? I think this is actually a person. Upon saying that, I sighed with relief, but it didn't last long. I went to the head area and began to cut the skull. What I found there left me perplexed. The head was hard, as if it were made of a very resistant metal, but it had some joints where I could open the skull. This opened in two, and what I saw inside left me speechless. There was a small being, apparently alien, very thin, with large eyes and a disproportionately large head. It was sitting in the center of the skull, surrounded by mechanisms that seemed to control the movements of the body, but the being was already lifeless, which seemed a bit sad to see. I came to the conclusion that it was indeed a small alien that used this woman's body as a means of transport. Everything I saw told me that this technology was extremely advanced, even beyond what we could imagine today. I couldn't stop thinking about how incredible all this was. I was stunned, trying to process what I had discovered. Surprised, I went to write down and record everything I had seen. Moments later, Frank returned. I showed him everything, and he looked at me amazed. "This is amazing, Heinrich. I never thought extraterrestrial life existed on our planet. They hide it from us, but this must come to light. What do you think, Heinrich?" I hesitated to respond for a moment. I considered all the implications of what I had just discovered, but in the end I said nothing. I simply nodded. It was 2 in the morning when we heard someone coming. Frank told me to quickly store the body, and so I did, hiding it underneath where I had stored the first body. Luckily, it was just another patient. I received the body and worked on it until 6 in the morning. After that, I headed home, exhausted. When I got home, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept spinning around everything I had seen, the bodies, the technology inside the woman's head, the little alien. They were things I couldn't easily digest. My brain wouldn't stop processing what I had witnessed. I tried to distract myself by reading about the Apollo X and the moon landing, trying to delve deeper into these mysteries. Finally, around 10 in the morning, I fell asleep, exhausted. When I woke up, it was already 5 in the afternoon. It was time to return to the nocturnal struggle. When I arrived at the morgue that afternoon, I was still amazed by everything I had discovered and a little scared, I admit. But there I was, determined to move forward, even though my intuition was screaming at me to withdraw. I made myself a coffee and sat down, waiting for a patient to arrive. It was a quiet night until, at 9 o'clock sharp, that idiot Frank burst into my precious peace. He brought 2 bodies with him, and without saying much, left them in the room. He was in a hurry, said he would be back in an instant, and left as quickly as he had arrived. I cursed out loud, frustrated by the interruption, and took the bodies to the room to begin studying them. I started with the first one, the corpse of an old man who had apparently died just minutes before. Looking at him closely, I realized that he had a strong blow to the back of the head. That scared me, but I continued with my work. When I cut him, I discovered that this corpse was of a normal man. Everything was in order. Organs, tissues, everything. Fearful of finding something strange in his head, I opened it carefully, and to my relief, it was completely human. "My God," I muttered. "This is a normal man." I sighed with relief and moved on to the second body, trusting it would be another routine case. However, when I began to cut, a horrible stench, equal to that of the first alien body, invaded the room. I shouted a curse and ran to wash my hands and change my coat. I returned to the body with a mixture of fear and determination. Upon examining it, I noticed immediately something different. It had no rectum or reproductive system. Intrigued, I cut deeper, and instead of the greenish tubes I had found before, this one was full of something that looked like asparagus, but much thicker and harder. I cut all parts of the body, and in each one I found the same structure, similar to asparagus. The entire body was made up of that material, from the feet to the neck. When I reached the head, something told me there was more to discover. When touching certain areas, the head came off easily, revealing a being hidden inside. It looked like a slug, but with an even more grotesque shape embedded inside the individual's head. I cut it completely and examined it. It was a hideous being, similar to a jellyfish, with connectors that joined the body from the neck. I began to document everything, writing and audio recording every detail I observed. This took me about 30 minutes. Afterwards, I went to the first cadaver, the old man's, which showed no signs of being extraterrestrial, and placed it nearby. When I went back to store the alien, I noticed something strange. A dense, dark smoke was coming from the door. I approached, but upon inhaling it, I began to feel dizzy and fell to the floor, unable to stay conscious. When I woke up, I still felt dizzy. I slowly got up and held onto the gurney of the body, which was now covered with a white sheet. I remember thinking, what the hell? I hadn't covered the body. I removed the sheet and horror invaded me. On the gurney was no longer the body of the alien being, but the body of Detective Frank, dead in the same place where the alien should be. I jumped in fright and noticed that there were several bullet holes in his chest, at least 6, maybe more. When I removed the sheet completely, a small piece of paper fell to the floor. I picked it up and read it. The message said, "This man ended up like this because he meddled where he shouldn't have. He deliberately murdered citizens of extraterrestrial origins to prove they really exist. They do exist and live among us as normal people." At the end of the note, my name was written in large letters. "If you don't leave this job, you'll end up like him, since you know too much about it." I threw the paper to the floor, feeling a mixture of terror and desperation. I ran to the containers where I had left the 2 bodies, but they were no longer there. My heart was pounding as I headed for the door to get out of there, but just as I was about to escape, I saw the older man, dressed in his black suit, waiting for me. I tried to apologize for what I had done, babbling words that I didn't even understand myself. He just looked at me, his eyes cold and empty, and then turned around and left without saying a word. I went back into the room to collect my files, but nothing was left. They had taken everything. I cursed out loud and ran from that place, feeling like I was getting out by the skin of my teeth. I went home, but couldn't sleep all night. I felt they were surrounding me, my house, watching me, making sure I didn't talk. The next morning, I took all the money I had saved and moved to Austria. Today, so many years later, I reflect on what happened in that morgue. On the nights when I can't sleep, the memories of those bodies of Frank and the men in black suits come back to me with the same intensity. I wonder, what really happened? What dark secrets remain hidden under layers of bureaucracy and silence? Sometimes doubt still assails me. Did I make the right decision by fleeing, by abandoning everything? Perhaps I'll never know. What I do know is that the world keeps turning, indifferent to the hidden truths that remain buried in places like that morgue. The beings that control those secrets continue to operate in the shadows, and those who dare to uncover them pay a very high price. I was lucky, or perhaps cunning, to escape before it was too late. For years I kept silent, fearful that they would find me. I spoke, but time passes and with it fear fades. It no longer matters if they come for me. I have lived my life. I have left my legacy in something much simpler and mundane than music. And now, in the twilight of my existence, I feel it is my duty to share what I saw, if only so that someone somewhere knows the truth, because in the end it is that truth that really matters. No matter how many years pass, the facts remain. They exist. They are here among us, living as normal people, waiting for the right moment to reveal their true nature. And when they do, the world will never be the same again.